over in the building next door. So we'll have a break in between our sessions. Feel free to go over there and look through any of that you may want to look through. And there was a third announcement. Oh, I passed out the outlines. If you did not get one, there may still be some in the foyers. If you did not get one, you would like to, let me know and I'll go make some more copies. Okay, we're glad that you're here. We have with us Dr. Jeff Miller from Apologetics Press. Dr. Miller holds multiple degrees in the physical sciences, including an earned master's degree from the University of Texas at Arlington and a PhD in biomechanical engineering from Auburn University, with emphasis in thermodynamics, biothermal science, biotransport phenomena, and navigation and control of biological systems. While at Auburn University, he also instructed courses in the thermal sciences. He's participated in several creation geologic expeditions with leading creation geologists studying seismites, dinosaur fossil beds, and the Grand Canyon, and is currently studying hypogene, we talked about this, speleogenesis in North America in caves. He is also an adjunct instructor at Freed-Hardeman University, instructing physical science courses on the flood, and leads flood-related tours annually in Arizona and Kentucky. Jeff serves at Apologetics Press as the director of the Creation Research Program and the associate editor of the Christian Evidences Journal, Reason and Revelation. Dr. Miller is the author of several books, including Science versus Evolution, Flooded, In the Way He Should Go, Ancient Marriage in a Modern World, and Dating Without Detonating. He's a co-author of the Defending the Faith Study Bible, and he's married to Julie and has 5 children. And I will now turn this over to Dr. Miller.
Appreciate very much the elders seeing fit to have this event this weekend, seeing the need for this in a time where this issue is at the forefront of our minds in the school system and so forth, and it is making a big impact on our young people in particular. Appreciate you being here this evening. I know there's a lot of things you could be doing on a blustery Friday evening, and we'll have a lot of material to cover, and hopefully you're eating your Wheaties each day. Be sure to eat them tomorrow. We got a lot of material to cover tomorrow, and hopefully these outlines that I have for you will help you to stay fresh and stay up with me on the things we'll be looking at on this subject of science versus evolution. I'd like for you to imagine for a moment your young people, like at this congregation, lined up across the front here of the auditorium. Can you picture them? Some of them are shy. Some of them won't stand still. Some of them are being hams. Now, according to statistician and member of the church, Dr. Flavel Yakeley, 40% of those are going to fall away when they leave home. That's what the statistics are showing us. 4 out of 10 will leave Christianity, leave the church. Does that concern you? Of those 40%, half of them go into the denominational world. Half of them become totally irreligious, with a high percentage of those individuals citing science issues as the reason for their departure. So things that they learned in science class shook their faith in what the Bible teaches, and so they left the faith. Their faith was more than just lessened, it was destroyed. And the typical reasons given to the surveyors are that they learned about evolution in high school and in college, and they came to disbelieve in supernatural things because they had been taught naturalism. So they disbelieve in things like miracles. They believe that there's a lack of evidence for God, since you can't do science on God. And there's a lack of evidence for creation and the flood. And they believe that Christianity goes against the evidence. It's not supported by evidence at the very least, but goes against it, goes even against logic and common sense. Now, does that surprise us? 87%, approximately 87 to 90% of the young people in our country are in the public school system where the bulk of their life from age 5 up through age 18, they're receiving the official doctrine of naturalism for multiple hours a day. So some form of evolution is implied in virtually every class that would have any relevance to that. And so their explanation that they're getting daily about where the universe came from, where the earth came from, where humans came from, is from a naturalistic perspective, because the Supreme Court outlawed being able to teach the creation model in the public school system. So do you think that this subject is extremely important for these younger generations? I know of some members of the church that see no need to spend much time on this subject. I hear them say things like, if I can believe in God and the Bible without ever having learned about this stuff, then everybody else can too. So this is a waste of time. But see, that's the problem, right? Because, maybe it's the case for many people that they didn't need answers to challenges like evolution and the Big Bang. Maybe they weren't really getting those challenges shoved down their throat day in and day out like these young people. But clearly, that's not the case for many of these younger people, because the statistics are showing us that we're losing them. The younger generations have left Christianity. And this isn't even including, these numbers that we're looking at, isn't even including the young people who didn't fall away due to these science-related matters, but they would have if they had not received answers to the challenges they were getting at school. So these from their parents and from their preachers and elders and so forth. And so we got to be ready to deal with these very fundamental issues in this increasingly naturalistic country that we're living in. I would argue that Christians have to be ready. We understand about church doctrine, right? We understand about the need to understand about things like baptism and, the organization of the church. Things like these are doctrinal issues. The naturalistic community has doctrine too. And we've got to know their doctrine to be able to understand where they're coming from and meet them where they are, which is what Paul did in Acts 17. I'd probably describe myself as one of those 6 kids that stuck with it, because I received the answers that I needed when my faith was being challenged, and it was being challenged. And I've always been a very skeptical-minded person whenever I was in high school, and also in junior high before that. The very first time, I still remember the first time I remember learning about evolution and an old earth, and it was in life science and then biology. I even remember being taught in history that the earth is tens of thousands of years old and humans were originally these unintelligent cavemen. And I remember evidence being presented for these things and it being taught as being, this is the more enlightened, evidence-based view. I remember feeling that way. And I remember being shaken by these things because I knew that didn't jive with what the Bible says about how people were in the past. The Bible didn't depict things that way. But I knew that I was supposed to trust my teachers. That's why I was in school, right? To learn from them. That's what my parents were expecting me to do. And I also knew that the civilization that we're living in today is extremely advanced compared to all of history, especially because of modern science. And I knew we live in this more enlightened age, and yet the Bible was written thousands of years ago in a time that wasn't enlightened in all these ways, in a time when people believed in Roman gods and other myths because they just couldn't explain things scientifically, so they would point at these superstitious ideas in order to get explanations for things. And I thought, how do I know that all of these highly educated evolutionists that wrote the textbooks aren't right and these ancient guys that wrote the Bible aren't wrong? And I remember hearing about theistic evolution. So basically the idea that, the secular guys are right about evolution, but that doesn't actually contradict what the Bible teaches. Now that initially helped, until I started studying the Bible more and seeing you can't jive these two doctrines when you study what the Bible teaches on this. And so I remember learning about some of the issues with evolution at church. I remember a seminar like this where the speaker came and showed some of the problems with evolution, and that was helpful to me. But I wasn't sure that everything was really being answered. His approach seemed to be wasn't very systematic. It was as if he was kind of poking holes, but he wasn't just going down the line and refuting the things that I was hearing in my school and so forth. He wasn't necessarily dealing with all those arguments. And the other speakers I'd heard on the subject, they weren't answering my questions, all of my questions either. And plus, I knew by and large, these guys, what they studied in school was Bible. They didn't study science. And so there was always that lingering question, do they really know what they're talking about? I mean, if they said this to a scientist, could the scientist deal with this? Were they really asking the right questions and showing real flaws in evolutionary thinking that evolutionists didn't have a legitimate response to? So I set out to answer these questions for myself, and this seminar is the result of that. So it is designed for me and those that are like me, especially young people that have a lot of questions and they don't want to just blindly believe that we're right and they're wrong. And it's a lot of material because in order to try to systematically dismantle evolution in the way that I needed to hear it, it requires covering a lot of material. There were so many questions I needed answered that I always struggle about cutting out stuff in these seminars. And I have cut out stuff over the years. It's just too much material. As I write more and more on these subjects, it makes me feel like, well, okay, I can point you to the website, point you to my books and our materials where you can get some of these other answers. But I don't want young people leaving and saying, okay, how come he didn't answer this? And is he hiding something? How come, is there anything he's not telling us? Now, many of the things that we'll look at this weekend, you will have likely heard about and studied because our preachers, by and large, have been completely right about these things. But even if you've heard many of these things, you probably will have not heard about it in this systematic way. And so I hope that this approach will help you. So bear with me as we move quickly through this weekend so I can cover a lot of ground. And if we're moving too fast, again, keep in mind we've got a lot of this material in written form, videos as well on our website. Is this being recorded or streamed or anything? Okay, so you got that available to you as well. Also keep in mind that this seminar is really kind of making the negative case for creation because we're dealing with the atheistic position, and by implication that shows that some supernatural model is correct. But we're not looking at all the positive evidence for creation. That's kind of really the second half of this study. That's a different seminar I do. We're dealing more with the first half in this seminar this weekend. And hopefully you can dig into the other side as well, because it's very exciting, very interesting to see make the positive case for our side. Come now and let us reason together, Isaiah said. And many naturalists, so a naturalist is a person that believes that everything has to be explained in the universe from a purely natural way, no supernatural involvement by a God. So atheists, agnostics, skeptics, naturalists would be surprised that a Christian would argue for that the Bible argues for reasoning, that there'd be an emphasis on that in the Bible, because that emphasis on evidence is not what the religious world around us would say about the nature of faith. Why would this be surprising? That's the issue. Many within Christendom who would self-identify as Christian incorrectly teach that biblical faith is not based on evidence, but is just this blind leap into the dark, accepting God without proof, blind faith. And Hollywood further promotes the idea. I still remember seeing Indiana Jones in the Last Crusade. Remember that Dr. Jones has to step out in faith, and then ends up being that there's this bridge there that he didn't see, but it was just this blind kind of leap. And that is what Christianity is portrayed as. That's what the denominational, by and large, believes about biblical faith. Now, remember the statement that was made in the 1947 movie, Miracle on 34th Street. Faith is believing when common sense tells you not to. Do you remember that statement? That most Americans every December hear that statement, right? So that sort of thinking gives Christianity and creation thinking a bad name and causes naturalists to scoff at the Bible and scoff at Christianity as not being evidence-based. Christianity is first and foremost a religion based on the facts. The world needs to understand that around us. Its true followers believe John 8:32. You can know the truth. And by knowing the truth, it'll set you free. You don't just have to accept the Bible and God without sufficient evidence. 1 John 4:1, remember John says, "Beloved, do not believe every spirit, but test the spirits whether they are of God." Why? For many false prophets have gone out into the world. Acts 17:11, what made the Bereans more fair-minded than those in Thessalonica? Well, they didn't just accept everything they were being told. They searched the Scriptures. They searched for evidence to substantiate the things they were being taught before they just blindly believed those things. John 10:37, Jesus even told his audience not to believe him if he didn't provide sufficient evidence for the things he was teaching. Christianity is a religion based on facts, evidence. The biblical portrait of faith is not what Christendom is making out faith to be today, as though it's this mystical, just kind of blind acceptance of God. That's not what the Bible teaches about this. The underlying word for faith is the same word you would use for the faith you have in your spouse. Why do you trust your spouse? Is it blind? No. Your spouse has proven themselves to be trustworthy, right? That is what biblical faith is all about. It's not a blind faith, it's an evidence-based faith, and yet the denominational world has rejected this concept and embraced this touchy-feely, emotion-based, anti-reasonable religion. And many have this more feel-good religion. And they don't really have evidence for what they believe, which makes it where their foundation is fragile and their young people are leaving the faith when they hear the alternate position. And they can't do apologetics and defend their faith. It's unfortunate that this is what is happening within Christendom, and this is what's happening in the church as well, because it's unbiblical and because it's hurting the case for God and for creation. Rational people rightly reject religion that isn't based on the actual evidence. People who believe in things for which there is insufficient evidence are by definition being irrational. And I'm going to keep hammering this concept over and over this weekend. In the field of philosophy, what is known as the law of rationality is used to determine whether a person is being irrational or illogical when coming to a conclusion about something. And this law says one should only draw those conclusions that are warranted by the evidence. In other words, you should only come to believe something that has enough evidence to prove it. And this is a biblical concept. 1 Thessalonians 5:21, for example, says, "Examine everything carefully," or "test all things," New King James has. Hold fast to that which is good. Before you hold fast to something is right, you better test it. You better examine it carefully. So the Bible, authored by God, tells us you can know the truth. It is not to be accepted without sufficient evidence. It can be tested, it can be proved, and God expects us to do that. Now, if the law of rationality is violated, if someone draws a conclusion that doesn't follow from the evidence, that person is being irrational. Okay, let's make sure we get this down. So we're going to hammer this a lot this weekend. So, for example, if a person, let's say you were born and raised out in the forest and you never saw a car ever, and you walked out of the forest and you come across a street for the first time and you see two green sedans drive by and you conclude, okay, wow, cars exist and all of them must be green. Okay, you would be being irrational because you drew a conclusion that you didn't have enough evidence to draw. Now, God does not expect you to trust in Him without sufficient evidence. He expects us to examine the evidence, weigh it, and come to the clear truth based on that evidence, to know the truth that will set us free, not just feel it without sufficient evidence. And the Bible makes it clear that God has in fact left enough evidence for us to come to the truth about his existence and the origin of the universe. It doesn't require blind faith because, for instance, notice what he tells us in Romans 1:20. Since the creation of the world, God's invisible attributes are clearly seen. How? Well, being understood by the things that are made. You can look at the things that are made, creation. You can do science, in other words. And by doing that, you'll come to know that God exists and even learn some things about him, his eternal power and Godhead. And in fact, there's so much evidence for them that you're without excuse if you don't come to that conclusion. You're not going to be able to stand on Judgment Day in front of God and say, this wasn't my fault. It's your fault, God. You didn't give me enough proof. You won't be able to do that. Paul says you'll be without excuse because the evidence is too enormous. It should force any rational person to the conclusion that there has to be a God. You're not going to be able to stand on Judgment Day as an atheist and point the finger at God. No, he's going to say, Psalm 14:1, the fool says in his heart there is no God, because the evidence is too clear on this. Biblical faith is based on evidence. It's not a blind faith, but many believe that Scripture and religion simply don't fit with science. That they're just two different arenas that don't really go together because science is based on evidence, they say, and faith, and religion is not. Popular skeptic Michael Shermer, who had a monthly column in Scientific American for many years, he said, for example, it's a logical absurdity to try to squeeze the round peg of science into the square hole of religion. Right? It's not logical to do that. It's irrational, is what he's saying. But in actuality, there's mounds of scientific evidence that exists that indicates that the exact opposite is true. Trying to squeeze the round peg of science into the square hole of naturalistic evolution is a logical absurdity, which is what we're going to be seeing this weekend. So defending the creation model isn't the objective of this weekend. Again, I have an entire seminar devoted to our side, making the case for our position and defending it. And so it explores that evidence. But the question we're looking at this weekend is, what about evolution? Is it a blind faith? Okay. The naturalist says no, and argues, he bases his beliefs on the things that you can observe physically and do science on, empirical science. And he argues creationists can't observe God. You can't observe this global catastrophic event, the flood. And so that makes us unscientific and irrational in his mind. Now, granted, we cannot directly observe God. You can't taste, touch, hear, smell, or see him. But neither can naturalists observe the Big Bang or the origin and evolution of life from a single-celled organism. So it's true that you can't use empirical science to directly prove that God exists, but it doesn't follow that there's no evidence for his existence. Consider the work of forensic scientists. They'll come in after an event, a crime, for instance, and examine the evidence. And they're able to come to reasonable, logical, rational conclusions about what happened without ever having actually witnessed the act, using different forms of reasoning. Now, much of what science is based on is this same principle, especially with regard to historical science. So when you're trying to figure out what happened in the distant past, events that are not observable today, so facts are discovered, inferences are made about what did happen, what will happen, what is happening, all without necessarily having physically witnessed whatever it is. And the nature of the evidence is indirect rather than direct. And so the blind faith believer concept's not true. Christianity is based on evidence. And some who identify as Christian do in fact have a blind faith, but they're not right in having that. But again, what about people who believe in naturalistic evolution? A reality completely devoid of anything supernatural. Whenever we examine the evidence, what we're going to see is that naturalistic evolutionists not only have a blind faith on several points, but they, unlike biblical creationists, have no choice but to have a blind faith. I'll make that point to you several times too. Using their own leading scientists to make the point, by the way. Now, before we dive into this, to a systematic study of this, let's think about perspective for a moment, our motivation for doing this. So a lot of time we're going to be putting into this weekend. Why is it important to spend all this time even dealing with this? What's the big deal? Who cares if evolution is true? Maybe God just created the universe using evolutionary theory or using long periods of time. What if he did? Who cares? Why spend a lot of time on this, cause a big stink over it, causing some people to reject creation of the Bible over the evolution issue because they think the Bible doesn't allow this. I've heard some people say that. Oh, you guys shouldn't push back against evolution. You're making it where you can't convert people. So by making a big deal about this, you might turn people away from Christianity. So they say it's not either or, creation or evolution. Why not theistic evolution? Why not an old earth? Well, these are valid questions. It deserves reasoning from the evidence. First of all, what is a theistic evolutionist? Simply put, a theistic evolutionist is a theist, so a believer in a God who also believes in some form of evolution. So he believes that there's a God, but that God used evolution to bring everything about. So a theistic evolutionist doesn't even have to be Christian in their thinking. There are many theistic evolutionists in other religions. But what we're going to be responding to specifically is theistic evolutionists who would self-identify as Christian. They believe in the Bible. That group believes in the God of the Bible and evolution at the same time. So now think about that for a minute. Where did they get that idea from? They didn't get that idea out of a straightforward reading of Genesis 1. So where did it come from? Well, something was presented to them, some evidence, some teaching that made them, for whatever reason, feel pressure. They felt compelled, for some reason, to reject a straightforward reading of Genesis 1. I think it's fair to say that. Maybe they felt pressure to believe in evolution because of their peers, or maybe they were just taught that evolution and Scripture are both right and they never studied it further. Maybe someone they respect believes in both. So, but regardless of whatever the reason, ultimately, they made a compromise on this and chose to not be a strict evolutionist or a strict creationist. They chose this in-between position. They attempt to harmonize evolution with creation and try to squeeze evolution into the Bible. Now, that's usually done in one of two ways, although there are many variants of these two. But in either way, a person reinterprets the Bible in such a way that evolutionary theory becomes possible. And usually that's done by reinterpreting the meaning of Genesis 1, very first chapter of the Bible. So, for instance, a person may argue that the days of Genesis 1 were millions of years instead of literal days. That's called the day-age theory. Some will add a gap between Genesis 1:1 and Genesis 1:2. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Then a lot of time happened. And then verse 2, now the earth was without form and void. That's called the gap theory. Some will add gaps of time between each of the days of creation, with each day actually being a literal normal day, but there being time between them. Call that the multiple gap theory. Some believe in evolution, but believe God just stepped in and intervened in some kind of creative act here and there during evolution to make it possible. We call that progressive creationism. Others reject evolution, but they still believe in an old earth. So that would be old earth creationism. So they reject biological evolution, but they accept geological evolution, would be another way to say that. And so we see all kinds of varieties in others. But the bottom line is many have attempted to accept biological evolution, that is Darwin's evolution, or geological evolution and an old earth and uniformitarianism that we'll talk about this weekend, and yet still accept God and the Bible. Now, can a person accept these beliefs and the Bible simultaneously and still be consistent? Can he really harmonize that with what the Bible teaches? Can he be okay in doing that? Has the Bible given enough information to even know whether evolution or the age of the earth, what it really is? If the Bible hasn't given enough information, then we really shouldn't be making a big stink out of it. Well, but if it does speak out on this issue, then it's just as important for us to talk about that as any other issue in the Bible, is it not? If God speaks on something, we're supposed to preach it, right? We don't stray away from the things that we or society doesn't like. So there's at least 8 reasons why I think it's important to think through and respond to this issue and take it very seriously. First of all, as I alluded to a moment ago, if you just read Genesis 1 and take it at face value, you just take the words that are stated and just let it talk to you, you're not going to get evolution or long periods of time out of creation week. Let an 8-year-old read Genesis 1, see if he can possibly get the modified gap theory out of that. You're not going to get that. And you're not going to get evolution out of a reading of Genesis 1. That's why virtually nobody did for thousands of years until what changed? Well, Darwin came along and popularized naturalism and evolution. And catastrophism, the flood, which was the dominant belief, it started being thrown out, and in geology, uniformitarianism started coming in with James Hutton and Lyell and so forth, and that became standard dogma in geology. You can trace this down historically. It was the 1800s. And these require long periods of time, and so many people started feeling compelled to believe them because that's what the scientific community, that was the direction they were going. And as some within Christendom began having to deal with these theories, what they believed about Scripture already was affected by that. Their faith in what Scripture straightforwardly teaches was shaken. Now, first of all, if the evidence that is used to promote these ideas is faulty, then there'd be no reason for their faith in Scripture to be shaken. But also, should a Christian's faith be in the fallible word and world of modern science, or the infallible Word of God? As long as the Bible can be properly understood on the subject of creation, and it can, then one should have complete faith in what it teaches, even if it's unpopular. Now keep in mind, step back, we're not talking about a blind faith in what the Bible teaches, and again, I talk about this in the creation seminar. Can we know that the Bible really is from God based on the evidence? The answer is yes. The Bible has attributes that prove it is beyond human capability. It is divine. So we can believe then what it says if it says something happened. So we can trust it. Not so much the findings of science, because it involves a lot of interpretation by fallible humans and so forth. But notice this becomes a major reason why we address this issue, because the underlying issue many times is a faith issue that often will be present with a person who accepts evolution. It's highlighting an issue regardless, are you going to go to hell if you believe in evolution? No, I'm not saying that. But if you have a faith, like if you don't trust the Bible, are you going to go to hell? Okay, now that's a different question. This can be a faith issue on your part if you don't accept what the Bible clearly teaches on something. Without faith, it's impossible to please Him. Hebrews 11:6. You can't do it. Now, granted, the anti-evolution, young earth position is not popular in academic circles and in the world in general. And so Christians argue, many Christians will argue, well, we could reach more people and make the Bible more palatable if we just allow for evolution or an old earth. We shouldn't be making a big deal out of this. And perhaps that argument would be worth consideration if the Bible didn't provide enough evidence to know the truth about any particular issue, but that's just not the case. There's enough evidence to know the truth on creation, evolution, the age of the earth, and to try to force evolutionary theories into the Bible would become what we call eisegesis, where you're trying to take the Bible, you're trying to make the Bible say what you want it to say, instead of exegesis, where you let the text express its meaning to you. So should a Christian adjust God's message to make it palatable to the world? Clearly not. Jesus came out and told us straight up, the world is going to hate Christians and our message, as it did Him and His message. John 15:18-20. The Christian message will be considered foolishness to the world, 1 Corinthians chapter 1 says, and yet the Christian is supposed to preach it anyway. So should we try to distort every doctrine that people have a problem with in the world? I mean, is that really how God wants us to treat Scripture? Of course not. Well, I'm just not real comfortable with the virgin birth idea. Well, okay, just a couple verses you need to adjust. We can adjust that for people to make them, because we'll convert more people. Really? Is that what we're supposed to do? Of course not. We should accept the fact that people are not going to like what the Bible teaches and teach it anyway. 2 Corinthians 3:12, therefore, since we have such hope, we use great boldness of speech. That's supposed to characterize how a Christian behaves. Oftentimes, acceptance of evolution is a matter of faith. But also, if the Bible actually teaches a young earth and teaches creation, not evolution, then if evolutionary theory is true, then the Bible is wrong, which would mean the Bible is uninspired. Genesis 1 is straightforward in its declaration that the universe was created in 6 normal days, literal days, and it gives no indication that it should be taken in any other way. It's not figurative or poetic in the context. It's narrative. It's giving straightforward history, and it's treated that way the rest of the Bible. Some argue, well, but with God, what am I about to say? A day is the same thing as 1,000 years. 2 Peter 3:8. I can quote a passage on that. So God could have meant that each day was long. All right, now first of all, is that really what 2 Peter 3:8 is meaning to say? You've got to be careful not to twist the Scriptures to your own destruction on any issue. No, this is not what 2 Peter 3:8 is teaching. It's saying that with God a day is it's like 1,000 years. It doesn't say a day is 1,000 years. Like every time you read a quote from God where He mentions a day, you need to translate that into 1,000 earth years. Every time He does that. As though God is not capable of communicating properly with humans using our words. That's kind of silly, isn't it? No, in the context, the point he's making is that when we begin thinking, man, God, you're taking so much time to come back and deal with all these people out here, we have to remember that time is irrelevant to God because He is above time. He's not just everywhere. He's every when. God's already in the future. That omnipresence is a big deal because God had to create time. Time is something that had to be created, or even He is subject to it. So if He created it, that means He's in the future. He's everywhere, in every when. So that's why to God, time doesn't mean anything. It doesn't mean though that He doesn't understand human time as He created it. That's a totally different thing. This is not arguing that every time you see the word day in the Bible, you need to change it to an eon. But even if you were to take this passage literally, which is what they're trying to do, you'd still have to argue that the days of Genesis 1 are just 1,000 years. They're not millions or billions, which is what the evolutionary scenario requires. And what's more, if the days of Genesis 1 are eons of time, what in the world do you make of the years that are mentioned in Genesis 1? So if you take the word day in Genesis 1 and 2 Peter 3:8 in that way, it simply makes no rational sense. It can't be harmonized with the text. Now think about it. Moses used practically every means at his disposal in the Hebrew language to convey the concept that the days of Genesis 1 are normal, approximately 24-hour days, which eliminates the possibility of creation days that are millions of years long. The Hebrew word for day that is used in Genesis 1 is yom. Okay, there's different words for day. He selected yom, and it almost always means either a full 24-hour period or the light period of a day, the 12-hour period of a day where it's light. Now, the day-age theorists will say, well, in some places it can mean a general period of time. Back in my day, we did such and such. See, that's not a literal usage of the word day. Well, as in modern English, you have to use the context of a statement to determine how a word is being used if there's multiple possible meanings. And don't we do that constantly without trouble? Back in my day, we went to the store during the day and we didn't wait 3 days to get it done. Now, do you have any problem figuring out what such a sentence means, even though the word day is actually used in 3 different ways in the same sentence? Well, Moses helped his audience to understand his use of the word day by modifying it with numbers. So the evening and the morning were the first day. The evening and the morning were the second day, the third day, and so forth. In the over 200 such occurrences in the Old Testament, the meaning of Yom always is a literal 24-hour day. He further helped by using the words evening and morning. These words occur 348 times in the Old Testament, and every time they're used with Yom in literature, like the terminology being used in Genesis, non-prophetic language, they always refer to literal 24-hour days. And ironically, he could have used the Hebrew word dor, which means a long period of time, a generation, but he doesn't do that. He uses Yom, he modifies it with numbers, he uses evening and morning with the word. There's really not much more he could do to make sure we understood how this went down. It's as though God knew somehow what people were going to try to do. Number 3, believing that the Genesis account is not literal and somehow allows for long periods of time and evolution puts Moses, Paul, and even Christ himself in the position of being mistaken or liars. I mean, what do you do with Moses in Exodus 20:11 when he says, "In 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea, and all that is in them, and rested the seventh day"? What's left beyond the heavens, the earth, the sea, and all that is in them? That's all of it. And he says that was done in 6 days. Right? It wasn't a bunch of it was created and then a big gap of time and then God creates some more. No. 6 days, referring back to Genesis 1, which Moses had just written about. You'd have to significantly twist this scripture to miss the message Moses is conveying. Now, the gap theory and Clayton's modified gap theory have the universe being created gradually in steps over eons of time, but this passage doesn't leave room for that interpretation. Everything is created in 6 days, not 6 billion years, and God rested on the seventh day. The whole 7-day week concept is based on this idea, with the Jews celebrating the Sabbath on the 7th billion years. No, they didn't get that. Did they get it wrong? Is that what they were supposed to do? The Jews kept the Sabbath after every 6 literal days of every literal week, and guess what happened if they didn't do it correctly? They were executed, which is what happens in Numbers 15. We got an incident where somebody didn't do it the way God expected them to do it. Proper observance of the Sabbath day was a big deal. They were to keep that week as a parallel to how God created the universe. Again, it's as though God wanted to emphasize this. Again, the Bible just doesn't leave room for evolutionary thinking. If what we get from a straightforward reading of the creation account is not right, then the Bible writers are wrong. Was Moses wrong when he said that the existence of the birds actually preceded the dinosaurs? Evolution has it the opposite direction. What about the creation of earth preceding the creation of the stars? Again, that doesn't jive with evolutionary models. And if the days of Genesis 1 are long periods of time, you got other issues. Could the plants have lived eons without the necessary symbiotic relationships from day 5? Plants created on day 3, the flying creatures on day 5, they don't show up. So day 3 to day 5, I mean, if we're talking about millions of years, how's that going to work? Could they have survived without the sun for millions of years, right? Without photosynthesis? The text says that the light of day 1 was divided from the darkness, with the light being called day and the darkness being called night. So whatever light was created on day 1, you can't say that that's how it sustained the plants. Because it's very interesting to me that Moses so nails this down as though anticipating every argument that's going to be coming. So if the days were eons of time, then by implication, the light period on day 1, days 1 through 3, before the sun's around, would be long periods of time, and the darkness would be long periods of time too, which would kill off all the plants. So was Moses wrong? Well, if so, we need to tear out the first 5 books of the Bible, as well as all the pages of the Bible where the other writers refer back to Moses, including Jesus himself doing it, right? Was Paul wrong in Romans chapter 1 when referring to man, verse 18, he says God's attributes have been clearly seen since the creation of the world, verse 20. Now, if man wasn't around for millions and billions of years, which is what evolution claims, then it could hardly be said that God's attributes have been seen by men since the creation of the world. That is, from the beginning. Okay, well, now you need to tear out Romans, and then all of his epistles. Most of your New Testament needs to be torn out. Can't trust what Paul has to say either. How about Mark 10:6, where Jesus said God made man from the beginning of creation, male and female, quoting from Genesis 1:27, talking about Adam and Eve. The beginning of creation didn't start with genderless, single-celled organisms. There were male and female humans on the scene in the beginning. You cannot jive this with evolution. Was Jesus wrong? Guess what? The entire Christian faith crumbles if he's wrong about this. Again, Luke 11:50-51, Jesus said that Abel's blood was shed at the foundation of the world. All right? Now Abel, he doesn't come around until after Adam and Eve. That's even further. And yet Jesus said that's still at the foundation of the world. Not if evolution is true. This is a chart of the evolutionary timeline, starting when evolutionists believe the earth formed. They would say it formed 4.5 billion years ago, roughly. So according to the evolutionary timeline, guess where humans show up on the scene? The very, very end of the timeline, not the beginning. Only about 2 million years ago as compared to 4.5 billion years ago. So if evolution is true, or the concept of deep time and an old earth, then Jesus and Paul are either mistaken or liars, and our faith is hopeless. Now this is an approximate timeline of the creation model. So according to the creation model, the earth has been around for just a few thousand years, 6,000 to 8,000, and man has been around with it from the beginning, since the creation of the world, from the foundation of the world, only 5 days removed from the beginning of time. Mark 10:6 really makes it even worse for the evolutionary model, because the beginning of creation, according to the Big Bang model, would be even further back. Not just the beginning of the earth, but all the beginning of creation, that's 13.8 billion years ago, according to the Big Bang model. So which model fits the text? It's pretty straightforward. Paul and Jesus, you got a problem if you want to try to say that they didn't get this right. Someone says, well, couldn't Adam and Eve have been in the garden for a long time, millions of years, before ages started being counted after the first sin? All right, well, we can investigate that too. It doesn't work for at least 3 reasons. Number one, Genesis 1:14 tells us that the purpose of the stars, as God created them, was for humans to be able to tell time with, to mark signs, seasons, days, and years. All right, y'all remember this? That was the purpose of the stars. So from the beginning, years are being counted. That was the whole point. Number 2, we have a pretty good idea of how long Adam and Eve were in the garden. It wasn't very long. We have an article on our website addressing that. Probably less than 9 months by implication. But number 3, Luke 11:50-51 indicates that Abel's death, which is after the first sin, was still shed at the foundation of the world. So if there were eons of time before the first sin, then Abel's death could hardly be at the foundation of the world. So you can't squeeze time in there either. All right, number 4, if theistic evolution is true, then the events of Genesis chapter 1 cannot be actually literal history. They can't mean what they seem to be saying. They must be figurative, poetic, symbolic, non-literal, even though there's no indication of it. Now the problem is that Genesis is in a historical setting. It's in a literal setting, has every indication of being literal historical truth, and again, all the Bible writers after them treat it as such. Think about the genealogies. What's the point of the genealogies? The genealogies are basically proving to you where Jesus came from, right? That he traces back to who? A real Adam. I mean, that's why they're there. So the Bible views this as real history. And it's an essential part of proving that God did what he said he was going to do in Genesis 3:15. Right? Whenever you have his first promise of bringing Jesus into the world later, the rest of the Old Testament is telling you how he fulfilled his promise about Genesis 3:15. It's essential that these are real people in Genesis. One scholar even conducted a statistical analysis of words in 97 different poetic and narrative biblical texts and showed that Genesis 1 and 2 unquestionably belongs in the narrative category, giving real history. You can check out our website for more on that, as well as Don DeYoung's book, Thousands Not Billions. I think I brought one of those that's for sale back there if you're interested in that, where it goes into this topic more. So if Genesis 1 can be taken to be non-historical, in spite of all the evidence against that interpretation, then anything in the Bible can be treated the same way if you don't like it. Anything and everything in the Bible becomes questionable as to whether you can take it literally. You know, I don't really like the idea of those miracles happening. I just think that's far-fetched. So I think that's a figurative context. Okay, really? Is that what, that's eisegesis. You're taking your feelings, your ideas, and shoving it into the text instead of letting the text tell you what it wants to tell you. Now, you may not like it, but don't try to make it say something that it's not saying. That's irrational to do that. That's illogical. You know, but I don't like what it says about divorce. I think that's a figurative section too. The reliability of any message in the Bible becomes suspect because of a person's lack of faith in what the Bible teaches. That's what this issue is, leading more and more people into total faithlessness. Why? Because if you can't trust the clear meaning of the obvious things in the Bible, how can you understand the harder parts? Can any of the Bible be trusted? Can any of it be known and properly understood? Notice how Jesus himself put it in John 5:47. In discussing the writings of Moses, which include Genesis, right? He says, if you don't believe his writings, how will you believe my words? Jesus takes it serious, what's going on in Moses' writings. Are we going to believe it or not? The truth is, Darwinian evolution and the Bible are not compatible. A fifth reason is that we want to be rational. We want to know the truth. We want to examine the evidence and follow it wherever it leads, as Scripture tells us to do. If creation, as it has been understood, is incorrect, then we want to know that, because we want to make sure we're teaching the truth. But if creation is correct, then we want to know that too. We want to be rational. We want to prove all things, hold fast what is good. Number 6, we don't want to teach error, do we? The Bible doesn't speak kindly about those who teach error. In twisting the Scriptures by teaching an erroneous interpretation will bring destruction, according to 2 Peter 3:16. And Genesis 1 is Scripture. If we teach error about that, that's not a good idea. We maybe don't put enough emphasis on that concept. That's a big deal, teaching the truth on this subject. Job 13:7, will you speak falsely for God? Would we want to attribute something to God that he didn't do and say that he did things in a way that he didn't? You know, in 1 Corinthians 15, Paul is giving a defense of the fact that there will be a resurrection from the dead. Souls are not annihilated at death. There's an afterlife. And he argues that if there's no afterlife, then Jesus wasn't resurrected. Yes, and we are found false witnesses of God, because we've testified of God that he raised up Christ, whom he did not raise up, if in fact the dead do not raise. So question, would we want to be false witnesses of God and ascribe to God activity that he did not do, like using evolution, if he didn't use evolution? If God did not use Darwinian evolution, and yet evolutionists say he did, then are they not giving false witness of God? Well, we understand, I think, if we look at it that way, that's not a good idea. Number 7, if evolutionary thought becomes widespread in a society, it will harm that society. And there is no question about this. I've got an entire session I could do just on this topic. Notice what I'm going to quote a lot from Richard Dawkins, because he's probably the most famous of the evolutionary biologists. He's an Oxford University guy. This is what he said. My own feeling is that a human society based simply on the genes law of universal ruthless selfishness, in other words, evolution, would be a very nasty society in which to live. Why? Well, because if people are living out the implication of evolution, if they're being taught that they're just an animal day in and day out from a young age, is that happening in our country? it creates a dark place. Do we see a dark place around us that's getting darker, it feels like all the time? Evolution is about the selfish battle for survival. It's about eliminating the weak in favor of the strong. And it's about viewing ourselves as animals, slightly more evolved than the rest of the animal kingdom. And when our young people are taught from a young age to view themselves as mere animals, why in the world wouldn't they act like animals? It gets a little creepy when you think about some of the things going on in the school system with the fuzzies and all, right? It's serious business what's going on. Consider the effect that evolution had on Jeffrey Dahmer. He murdered and dismembered 17 men and boys, engaged in sexual activity with his dead victims, ate some of them, experimented on them while they were alive, injecting things into their brain, kept the skulls as trophies. All right, natural question, why? In an interview in 1994 on MSNBC, talking with his dad, here's what Dahmer said. Let's see if I can get it.
Feel that everyone is accountable for it.
Let me pull it back here a little bit.
Let me ask, when did you first feel that everyone is accountable for their actions?
Well, thanks to you for sending that creation science material, because I always believe the lie that evolution is truth, the theory of evolution is truth, that we all just came from the slime, and when we died, that was it. There was nothing. So the whole theory cheapens life, and started reading books about that show how evolution is just a complete lie. There's no basis in science to uphold it, and I've since come to believe that the Lord Jesus Christ is the true creator of the heavens and the earth. It just didn't just happen, and I believe that I, as well as everyone else, will be accountable to him.
Juan? At that period of time, I had drifted away from a belief in a supreme being. And I never, as a result, passed along the feeling that we are all accountable in the end. He owns us. And that basic concept is very fundamental to all of us.
You feel that the absence, at least for a while, of a strong religious faith and belief
for some years
may have prevented you from instilling some of that in Jeff.
That's right.
Is that how you feel?
Yes, I think I had a big part to do with it. I mean, if a person doesn't think that there is a God to be accountable to, then what's the point of trying to modify your behavior to keep it within acceptable ranges? That's how I thought, anyway.
Number 8, the primary reason we want to look at this theory in this weekend is because if evolution is false, atheism is false. Because if atheism is true, some form of evolution has to be true. Some form of evolution has to be true in order for atheism to be right. And so refuting it proves some form of creation. And incidentally also highlights the fact that not evolution, but creation should be being what's taught in the school system. If, of course, we're interested in children learning truth instead of superstitious concepts being advocated by naturalists. Notice what Shermer said regarding evolution. It doesn't take a rocket scientist or an English naturalist to understand why the theory of the origin of species by means of natural selection would be so controversial. If new species are created naturally, what place then for God? So he realized correctly that the options really aren't evolution, creation, or both. It's really creation or evolution. That's ultimately the way it's got to go. The minute a person compromises and accepts evolutionary idea instead of what the Bible says, why stop? If science can give an answer to the origin of everything without God, then why stick with the Bible? But on the other hand, if evolution can be shown to be false, then atheism is false, not having a mechanism that can rationally explain the origin of the universe. Now, if this topic of theistic evolution, progressive creationism, the gap theory, all these things, if you want to dive into these in a more in-depth way, I'd recommend you checking out this book, Creation Compromises, that we have available for free as a PDF on our website. And we also have a lot of articles on this, including some written by Justin Rogers, who's a PhD Hebrew linguist, where he looks at, for example, the word yom in Hebrew and shows the implications of that in the Genesis 1 account, as well as looking at bara and asa as they're used in Genesis 1, and is advocated by gap theorists as evidence of long periods of time. He looks at those as well. So it's either or, it's creation or evolution. Theistic evolution doesn't fit with the Bible. So either evolution is right and the Bible's wrong, or creation is true and evolution is false. Now, let's look more at evolution then. Then I want to begin a systematic study and refutation of the fundamental planks of naturalistic evolution, starting with a look at how the National Academy of Sciences defines science. One goal of science is to understand nature. The statements of science must invoke only natural things and processes. No supernatural, no God. The statements of science are those that emerge from the application of human intelligence to data obtained from observation and experiment. Progress in science consists of the development of better explanations for the causes of natural phenomena. So with this simple definition in place, God has been defined out of the topic, right? If anything could point back to God, it's not scientific. So it's now not allowed in scientific community with this idea being prevalent. Now, so according to modern science, God is unscientific because he's supernatural. He can't be directly observed or experimented on. Now, this is not how science was approached in the past. Science was not defined as the search for natural explanations for natural phenomena. It was viewed as a search for explanations for natural phenomena, whether or not they were natural. So many of the fathers of various scientific disciplines viewed science as a means to learn about the Creator, Romans 1:20. They would never in their wildest dreams have suggested that reason and rationality are somehow contrary to creation science. They would never propose the idea that God should be kicked out of the classroom. Johannes Kepler, the father of modern astronomy and modern optics, was a firm Bible believer. Robert Boyle, the father of chemistry, was a Bible believer. Samuel F.B. Morse, who invented the Morse code, was a believer. Wernher von Braun, the father of the space program at NASA, was a strong believer in God and creation as well as Louis Pasteur, the father of biology, Lord Kelvin, the father of thermodynamics, Sir Isaac Newton, the father of modern physics, Faraday, the father of electromagnetism. Astronomer Nicholas Copernicus developed the heliocentric model of the solar system. It was actually a creationist by the name of Antonio Snider Pellegrini who originally sketched the idea of continental drift. This was Alfred Wegener, decades later, was born and popularized the theory, but it was a creationist who originally came up with continental drift, drew the sketches, and said that he thought it was a result of the flood. Dozens of other well-known scientists from history could be cited. It could be argued that without creation science, we would still be in the dark ages in our understanding of science. So bottom line, science has now been hijacked by naturalists who are standing on the backs of Bible believers, creation believers, who fathered many, if not most, of the scientific disciplines that we study today. And yet, according to leading evolutionists, people who don't believe in evolution, people who believe in the Bible, are somehow unscientific, delusional, beholden to myths and fairy tales. Notice how Dawkins put it. It's absolutely safe to say that if you meet somebody who claims not to believe in evolution, that person is ignorant, stupid, or insane, or wicked, but I'd rather not consider that. I think it's ironic that Dawkins would say that about creationists. Since what we'll find is that it's actually the evolutionists that are irrational about this. They're the ones with the blind faith. Now, what do I mean by evolution as we begin this study? Science versus evolution. What are we talking about? There's many different definitions. Okay, does it just mean change? Well, we all believe in change. You're not exactly like your parents. Okay, so we believe in evolution. That's not what we're talking about. Do I mean biological evolution? So Darwin's general theory of evolution? Well, it can mean that, but that's not solely what we're going to be looking at. We're going to look at the evolutionary model, the whole naturalistic view of the origin and development of the universe. Sometimes it's called cosmic evolution, and it includes Darwin's theory of evolution on the biological side, but it also includes the cosmological evolution with the Big Bang and geological evolution with uniformitarianism. So it's the whole story of the universe from a naturalistic, a godless perspective. After life emerges in the cosmic evolutionary story, Darwinian evolution jumps in what we might call macroevolution. Now we distinguish that from microevolution. Microevolution would be the idea that there are small changes and varieties that happen within general groups of creatures, what the Bible calls kinds. So changes in size and color and beak shape and so forth, with the basic type of creature remaining the same. Microevolution has been observed to occur in nature. It's in perfect harmony with the creation model. In fact, the Bible even gives an example of microevolution happening, the story of Jacob. But macroevolution is the idea that all species on the planet evolved from a single-celled organism that emerged billions of years ago. So our goal this weekend is to systematically dismantle this idea of naturalistic evolution, the Big Bang and Darwinian evolution in particular. So if we were to boil down naturalistic evolution to some of its just most fundamental planks, here's what you have. Number one, the naturalistic evolutionary model would say the universe originally either spontaneously generated or is eternal. The creation model would say, no, it had to have been created suddenly by a non-physical entity, something that is not part of the universe. Number two, the evolutionary model would say at some point, life had to spontaneously spring into existence from non-life, what we call spontaneous generation of life. That's different from a spontaneous generation of matter and energy up here. Creation model would say, no, that can't happen. Life had to be created suddenly. Number three, the naturalistic evolutionary model would say macroevolution is true, and that's what accounts for all the different types of creatures. So ultimately, all the creatures had to evolve from previous simpler kinds, eventually getting back to that original single-celled organism at the beginning. The creation model would say all present kinds have remained constant since creation, with only microevolution occurring. The evolutionary model says, well, how do you get all those different species to come about from those earlier species? You need a mechanism for that. And they say neo-Darwinism is the mechanism for that evolution of these different types of creatures. Creationists say neo-Darwinism is insufficient to account for the emergence of these kinds from a simple primordial organism. Number five, evolutionists would say all creatures have common ancestors going back to the original single-celled organisms. But we're going to specifically look at the human and ape common ancestor idea because that's what's emphasized so much in the textbooks. Creationists would say humans and apes have a separate ancestry. The evolutionary model, this is getting into more the geological evolution side of things. The evolutionary model would say uniformitarianism is the way to view geology and understanding past events on the physical earth. Creationists would say catastrophism is the way to interpret the geological evidence. And the evolutionary model would have to argue that the universe is extremely old in order for all this to happen. And the creation model would say, no, it's actually relatively young. Now, if any one of these statements can be shown to be wrong, this entire model collapses. These are all considered essential planks to naturalistic evolution. So throughout the sessions, what we're going to be doing is going through each of these systematically and showing you how the evidence totally destroys each one of these planks. and therefore forces the naturalist to have a blind faith in order to accept this idea. And so we'll keep coming back to this chart several times. Now, the first item on the chart we'll look at for just a few quick moments regards the origin of the universe. So the most fundamental requirement that the naturalist has to explain is the origin of the laws of nature. Think about that. We know laws of nature exist. Where did they come from? So as we close this session, I want to introduce the idea of the laws of science, okay? Because they're going to be the focus of the next couple sessions. The laws of science have been discovered through extensive scientific study and investigation, gathering mounds and mounds of evidence that all demands a logical conclusion about how things work in the universe. They are, by definition, the concluding statement that has been formed for explaining how things work in nature at all times, without exception. According to the McGraw-Hill Dictionary of Scientific and Technical Terms, a scientific law is a regularity which applies to all members of a broad class of phenomena. So keep in mind three things about scientific laws. Number one, they apply to all members of a broad class of phenomena, not just some. There are no exceptions to a law of science, by definition. Number two, they describe what has been observed to occur in nature. They say nothing directly about supernature, because you can't observe that. Number three, a scientific law is by definition rational. It's the conclusion that has been drawn from all of the scientific evidence that demands that conclusion to be true. So remember, law of rationality, one should only draw those conclusions that are warranted by the evidence. Because the laws of science are the conclusions from a huge amount of evidence, then to hold to a belief that goes against these laws is by definition irrational. All right, good job. You guys are getting an A on the quiz here. Famous atheist theoretical physicist and cosmologist of Cambridge University, the late Stephen Hawking. He hosted a show on Discovery Channel. It's been probably 15 years ago now. He's passed away now, but he slammed theism, promoted atheism. By the way, he's no longer an atheist where he is, right? And in that show, he said, the universe is a machine governed by principles or laws, laws that can be understood by the human mind. I believe that the discovery of these laws has been humankind's greatest achievement. But what's really important is that these physical laws, as well as being unchangeable, are universal. They apply not just to the flight of the ball, but to the motion of a planet and everything else in the universe. Unlike laws made by humans, the laws of nature cannot ever be broken. That's why they're so powerful. The laws of nature are fixed. There's no exceptions to these. Evolutionists claim to believe firmly in these laws of science. They're champions of this because they champion the idea of being scientific and being naturalist, and these are laws of nature. But so if anything can be said to be scientific, it would be the laws of science. Now the question is, do the laws of science allow naturalistic evolution? Is evolution scientific? The first big question, which is as yet unanswered by these guys, that illustrates the fact that evolution requires a blind faith, is where did these laws come from? Who wrote the laws? Without a lawmaker, how could they exist? Humanist Martin Gardner wrote a few years ago, he said, imagine that physicists finally discover all the basic waves and their particles and all the basic laws and unite everything in one equation. We can then ask, why that equation? And why are there quantum laws? There's no escape from the super ultimate questions. Why is there something rather than nothing? And why is the something structured the way that it is? So even if you ignore the little problem of how the universe came into existence in the first place, you still have the problem of how the laws that govern that stuff came into existence. So why are there specific equations that we can assign to describe how things work in nature at all times? Why are there specific numbers that describe how things work? Equations, by definition, are not just random things. They indicate structure, intention, planning, purpose behind them, a mind. These words can't be used to describe chance processes and explosions, which is ultimately what the evolutionary model has to rely on. So bottom line, someone has to write these laws for the universe to follow, and I believe that the New Testament alludes to these and why these exist. It helps you understand these passages where it'll say, in him all things consist. Right? There's some interesting wording in a couple places in the New Testament that sound like God is literally upholding things. It's as though he's making gravity happen. It's a fascinating thing to me because science, we talk about what's happening, but we can't explain why it is. Like science can't answer that question. Why does gravity exist? It's like this invisible thing that just, this is how things happen. This is what they do. Why? I don't know. They don't have any explanation for this. Now, wait a minute. If there's not a reasonable answer to the question of where these laws came from, then how can you confidently say that naturalism is true? Stephen Hawking believed that quantum mechanics could create a universe from nothing before the supposed Big Bang, which he also believed in. But again, even if that were true, and the evidence stands against it, we'll look at that, Hawking himself still had to ask the questions, did God create the quantum laws that allowed the Big Bang to occur? In a nutshell, did we need a God to set it all up so that the Big Bang could bang? Now, his stubborn answer was no. The problem is he could provide no answer to those questions. And yet he didn't even attempt an explanation, and yet he still blindly believes in naturalism. Okay, who's got the blind faith here? I mean, he flat out rejected the idea of God, whose existence would give him a logical answer to the question, which reveals his own bias against the supernatural and his lack of objectivity, his unscientific approach to this question. How could a law of nature exist without a law writer? Another famous atheist, a theoretical physicist, cosmologist, and astrobiologist at Arizona State University, Paul Davies, he called Hawking on this when Hawking said this and said, you need to know where those laws come from. That's where the mystery lies, the laws. So he just came out and said, this is a mystery. We have no idea how these laws exist. Yeah, you don't have an answer because you can't have a law without a law writer. That's illogical. Is there any evidence today that scientific laws are popping into existence? The naturalist has to believe that can happen, even though there's no evidence for it. What is that called? What are they being? Irrational. They're drawing conclusions not warranted by the evidence. There's no evidence that can happen, and they have to believe it. They have no choice but to believe that can happen. You see that? Because the laws exist. Nobody denies that. They have to believe they can create themselves, otherwise you'd have to point to a God. And yet there's no evidence that it can happen. They have a blind faith. Evolution is a modern, respectable form of superstitious mumbo-jumbo. That's what it is. It's considered respectable today, but it's really just a modern form of witchcraft without a witch. It's really what we're talking about. The existence of the laws of science are proof that a God must exist, logically, rationally. We're just following the evidence. Evolution is inadequate to attempt to harmonize with the evidence. Now, one of the things that I'll try to point out over and over in these sessions is that all the while the naturalistic model doesn't have a reasonable explanation for several critical points, the creation model gives you the answer to this. And the fact that the Bible has supernatural characteristics is evidence that points to the fact that that's really the truth. It's an evidence-based idea to say that what it says happened. The creation model stands unscathed as the scientific evidence grows. They can't explain the origin of the laws of science. We know exactly where they came from. Long before the laws of thermodynamics were formally articulated in the 1800s, and long before the law of biogenesis was formally proven by Pasteur in 1864, the laws of science, of course, were already written. Think about the last few chapters of the book of Job. God made a speech to Job, remember, humbling him with the knowledge that Job knew essentially nothing in comparison to God, who knows everything, created everything in the universe. And as he's humbling Job, he asks him two questions. Do you know the ordinances of the heavens? Can you set their dominion over the earth? Now notice, God is telling Job there are laws of science. And we're not in a position to create those and make them govern the universe. We don't even understand how that could happen. But what is he implying? He is doing that, and that is the only way to explain this. There's not a natural way to explain this. Of course, you would expect them to be in harmony with the creation model, because God himself actually created everything. Well, when we think about the world around us, it's loaded with billions of people. Islam's rapidly on the rise, about 2 billion now. Hinduism has over 1 billion. The irreligious make up over 1 billion people. That includes your atheists and so forth. Christendom, still the largest religion. Islam is catching up quickly. About half of Christianity is Catholicism. And then of the Protestants, we know, of course, hardly any of them are Church of Christ guys. And the question that we should consider is, are we ready to defend the truth against all of the ideas that are out there? 1 Peter 3:15 tells us that all Christians are expected to be apologists. Somebody contacted, this happens periodically, somebody will contact us irritated. I really like what you guys are doing at Apologetics Press, but I don't like your name because you don't have anything to apologize for. I appreciate it. There's a lot of people laughing because that tells me you actually know what this word means. Some places I go, when I say that, they look at me like, oh, I know. Like, okay. Okay, so apologetics comes from the underlying Greek word apologia, which is what's used here. Always be ready to apologia. Not apologize, it means to give a defense to everyone. Right? So as these different ideas are exploding around us, we're supposed to be, as Christians, ready to provide reasonable, not blind faith, but reasonable answers to the questions that people are bringing up. Being ready when it's popular and when it's not. Remember that Ezekiel 3 has those eerie words. When I say to the wicked, you shall surely die, and you give him no warning, nor speak to warn the wicked from his wicked way to save his life. Okay, well, that same wicked man will die in his iniquity, but his blood I'll require at your hand. Yet if you warn the wicked, and he doesn't turn from his wickedness, nor from his wicked way, he shall die in his iniquity, but you have delivered your soul. You know, we're expected to be ready to deal with the attacks being made on Christianity by atheists and warn people about sin and the dangers of ignoring the truth. We're not supposed to just be wallowing in the great blessings that we enjoy, which God dumps on us every second of our life. We're supposed to be turning around and making sure that we're dealing with what's going on out there, and naturalism is on the rise. We're up to 1/4 of Americans now that are purely naturalistic. The majority of Americans believe in evolution, but a lot of those theistic evolutionists are moving into naturalism, and so naturalism is quickly rising in our country. And what are we doing? Do we know these doctrines? That's what we're trying to do this weekend. Are we ready to talk to people about these things? We're expected to be. So I work at Apologetics Press. We're a nonprofit brotherhood organization dedicated to apologetics. And I'm thankful that this organization has been around since something like 1980. It's been useful to me over the years as well, before I was at AP. But the idea is, with so many things out there that we as Christians are supposed to be ready to give a defense on, how are we going to have time to do all the research that needs to be done? And so Apologetics Press, the idea is that we have these individuals that are credentialed enough in these different areas where we can do that study for you, package it in a way where you can use it, where you can go out and do the apologetics that you need to be doing, and give you the answers you need to solidify your own faith, the faith of your children, but also to teach this to other people. So I brought a lot of materials back here, and the point here, again, we're a nonprofit organization. The point here isn't for us to make money off of this. The point is to get you what you need to be able to go teach people. because you're the front lines, and when push comes to shove, you got to be ready to talk about these things to other people. And so throughout the weekend, I'm going to try to highlight some of the materials that we have, explain to you what it is so that you know whether or not this is something you need to have in your library. Maybe you know somebody that needs this particular material, or maybe you know you need to bone up on this particular area of apologetics or whatever it might be. But lots of materials back there for you to look at and purchase and think about for yourself as well as your loved ones. All right, we are going to pause now for a 10-minute break, I think, Robert?
Yes, and there is evidence of refreshments.
There's evidence of if you just follow the crumbs, refreshments back there. All right, thank you for your attention. We'll start back in about 10 minutes. this on? We good? All right. We got one more session. You are not allowed to get sleepy. So I got up at 3:45 a.m., so I don't want to hear any complaints. No complaints. Okay, in our last session, I introduced this chart. And remember that if any one of these items on here can be shown to be false, then the entire model collapses. And yet we're going to deal with all of them. So our goal is to systematically address this whole naturalistic evolutionary idea, and especially make the point that the evolutionary model requires a blind faith. So hopefully you've already seen that proven already with the mere origin of the laws of science. But we're going to keep coming back to this chart quite a bit, and I'm going to be giving you lots of quotes in these sessions, so bear with me as we wade through these quotes, because I want to show you what the leading naturalistic evolutionists themselves say. I think that's a powerful way to make your point whenever you have hostile testimony. That's where even the people that would not agree with you actually testify to the points you're making. And so that's powerful testimony, and I want to be able to show you a lot of those, but I'll try to break these quotes down for you whenever we see those to help you understand what they're saying when they're using a lot of jargon and so forth. So let's start with now, we've looked at just the origin of the laws of science. That has to happen at the same time that the universe begins. But along with the origin of the laws of science would be the origin of the universe itself. So where did the universe come from? Most naturalists today argue that cosmic evolution began with the Big Bang. And so let's look at that theory in this session. According to the currently popular form of the Big Bang theory, keeping in mind that it changes basically ad hoc on almost a daily basis, it seems like. If you stay up with the literature, it has to change constantly as new evidence comes in. And especially in the last couple years, they're freaking out because when the James Webb Telescope was launched, it was taking pictures of distant stars and galaxies that totally destroyed Big Bang cosmology. And so they're kind of back to the drawing board on it. But the generally consensus idea among Big Bang believers is that 13.8 billion years ago, all of the stuff of the universe was all together in one infinitesimal point that was extremely dense and hot. And for some unknown reason, it expanded like a balloon. And the idea is that the stars themselves are not really moving. They're actually as though if you were to picture like sequins being attached to a balloon and then blowing it up, the sequins move relative to with the balloon itself, but they're not really moving on the balloon. The space between them is expanding, and that's how they kind of describe what's going on with the Big Bang idea. But initially, there is this inflationary period. So it's where you have not just expansion, but super fast expansion, where the universe is expanding faster than the speed of light. Nobody knows why that would be. In fact, it's not possible, according to scientific law, for things to move faster than that. But within the first speck of a second, it has to happen. The universe goes through this rapid inflationary moment. And then particles form in the first few seconds. And then the inflationary period stops and expansion continues, which is what we're still going through today. Atoms come about after about 380,000 years. The first stars form after about 300 million years. The first mature galaxies, they believe, formed after about 1 billion years. And then our solar system comes about after about 9 billion years. With Earth in particular, 4.5 billion years ago. Life comes into existence about 3.8 billion years ago, at which time Darwinian evolution then takes off, and then the dinosaurs, go extinct 65, 66 million years ago. The human group shows up about 2 million years ago, and so forth. So that's the Big Bang idea. Now, briefly, before we get into the guts of this, again, the Big Bang does not fit with Scripture. It's for the same reasons we looked at with theistic evolution. For example, Exodus 20:11, remember, God creates everything in 6 days, not 13.8 billion years. New Testament individuals would contradict what the implications of the Big Bang with those passages we looked at. The biblical genealogies don't allow for the deep time that's required by the Big Bang. The chronology also doesn't match up for Big Bang events either. So, for example, the biblical model, usually the song we sing with kids, day one, God made light when there was no, really there's a lot more being created on day one than just light, because the earth itself is created, water is created, space itself is created, in addition to time. Time itself is created, in addition to light. But the Big Bang model would say that earth, so the biblical model would say you've got space, water, the earth, all being created first. The stars, including the sun, don't come around until day 4. Big Bang model has the earth coming around billions of years after the stars show up. The Big Bang model has the sun coming about long before the plants, but the biblical model says the sun comes around the day after the plants. It's as though God was trying to be funny. I mean, it's because he flips all these things that the evolutionary model is trying to do. He'll flip it. Just we'll just do it the opposite day. Like he's just anticipating this. It cracks me up. The biblical model, or the Big Bang model, has the earth initially molten. The Bible has it as initially water, or at least water covered, maybe even made of water. The Big Bang has the fish coming about before fruit trees. The opposite is the case in the Bible. There's all these kind of discrepancies that show you the biblical model is just set apart, separate. You can't make these two harmonize. So what do we do with the Big Bang in particular? It's either or on this. There's 2 main lines of evidence that are typically given for the Big Bang. So 2 quick points for you to memorize and think about with regard to, you think about, okay, you should only draw those conclusions that are warranted by the evidence if you want to be rational. The 2 lines of evidence given for the Big Bang are these. Number 1, the universe appears to be expanding. All right, so if you've ever noticed the way sound sounds whenever, for example, a train's coming towards you and it's blowing its horn, you notice that the pitch changes as it comes towards you versus when it's going away. Right? You hear that? You hear that pitch change going on there. That's the Doppler effect, and you see something similar with wavelengths of light and radiation in space. And so scientists have used that information to determine a lot of cosmological stuff involving redshift values and Hubble's law and all this stuff to figure out how far away a star is and its velocity and its heading, whether it's moving away from us and so forth. And so from all of this, they believe there's solid evidence that the universe is expanding. Everything is moving away from each other. So logically, if you extrapolate backwards in time without the constraints of a young universe the Bible portrays, you would theoretically get to a point, or you could get to a point billions of years ago where the whole universe begins all combined in one spot when it all starts. And there's the Big Bang idea. Now there's problems with using expansion as any kind of conclusive evidence that the Big Bang happened. First of all, you have to keep in mind that it's possible that expansion is not even really happening. There's actually debate over that. We deduce that the universe is expanding based on certain assumptions which may not be correct. And there's some evidence that suggests that might be the case, at least not expansion that they're talking about. The evidence could be pointing to something totally different than what they're suggesting. But even if expansion is true, and I think the evidence seems to support that, and I don't have a problem with it, it still doesn't necessarily prove the Big Bang follows. Einstein, for example, he recognized expansion, but he was more than hesitant to subscribe to the Big Bang, which he called that theory abominable. That's what he actually called it. And now creationists have explained the expansion of space in light of a biblical framework. So expansion definitely doesn't prove the Big Bang. There's other ways to explain that. So the idea of expansion doesn't contradict creation. In fact, that may be what's being alluded to in various Old Testament passages. For example, here in Hebrew or Isaiah 40, the Hebrew word translated stretches out is an active participle, which according to Hebrew scholars indicates a state of continued activity, which would mean that the stretching out of the heavens was apparently continuing to occur at the time of Isaiah. This isn't just something that happened during creation. And so the stretching out, whatever he's referring to, would be continuing, which may be referring to the expansion of the heavens. Now, he compares God's activity in the heavens to that of spreading out a tent to dwell in and stretching out a curtain. Remember, cosmologists view it more like a balloon, but similar concept. Now, so expansion doesn't necessarily prove the Big Bang at all. So the second, in other words, it's insufficient evidence to draw the conclusion that the Big Bang happened. You would expect expansion, but it also may not mean that. It's not enough evidence to know that. The second evidence given for the Big Bang is what is called the cosmic microwave background radiation. You'll see it as like the CMB. So we've been able to take temperature of space and find that there is, I'm using that loosely, temperature of space, and we find that radiation permeates space uniformly everywhere at 2.7 Kelvin. Now, and so this is what they call the CMB, the cosmic microwave background radiation, this radiation out there. Now, it was predicted by Big Bang cosmologists that there would be radiation if the Big Bang happened. They would say that this is due to the early stages of the Big Bang, but they were way off in the details of their predictions, which means their prediction wasn't really verified. It was actually falsified, so they had to totally revamp everything. But they were excited because at least they found radiation, and they knew there should be radiation. And so they quickly went forward making their adjustments to their theory to try to make it fit the actual observable evidence. Now, when we look at that radiation and think about it, we find that it is a curiosity, because it's a universe-wide uniform temperature of this radiation. And it's long been understood by Big Bang cosmologists as a major problem for the Big Bang. They call it the horizon problem, that the radiation along the horizon everywhere is equal. So we're going to get a little technical just for a few moments, but try to follow me. So if you've got all of these points in space that are all the same temperature, the only way to get them all the same temperature is if they could exchange their heat, exchange their energy, and come to what we call thermal equilibrium, where all the temperature is uniform. So how could stars, for example, that are separated by, say, 20 billion light years, okay, meaning that it would take 20 billion years at the speed of light. It's a distance calculation. It's saying it would take 20 billion years at the speed of light for them to reach each other, right? Okay, how could points like that have exactly equal temperatures, since if the Big Bang is true, the universe isn't even 20 billion years old? The energy transfer could only be at the speed of light at most. So there just wouldn't be enough time for all of the universe to have such a uniform temperature if there hasn't been enough time for the universe to exchange energy. And so this would seem to demand a creator and nullify naturalism. They also recognize what's called the flatness problem. So if the universe is billions of years old and the Big Bang is true, then when you look at the nature of energy in the universe and you start taking ratios of this energy, you have gravitational potential energy and you have kinetic energy from things moving in the universe. And if you look at the ratio of these, they recognize it should be either basically zero or really big, and yet they recognize it's actually estimated to be basically the number 1. They see this as a problem because, again, that would either demand a young universe or a God or both. So how are they going to fix the horizon and flatness problems? And none of that maybe made sense to you, but these are huge problems, okay, for the Big Bang. So this is why they made up this inflation idea that I mentioned to you that happens at the beginning of the Big Bang. Nobody knows why it would happen, where everything's expanding faster than the speed of light, right? For just a moment. This is why they had to make that up. So inflation, the idea that the universe originally was in this point that expanded faster than the speed of light. And so if it all started at that point, it would allow for all of the universe to be touching at that point and reach thermal equilibrium at the beginning, which would cure the horizon problem. And it would allow inflation to drive the potential to kinetic energy ratio to be close to 1 at the beginning, which they say would fix the flatness problem. So inflation was literally just made up to try to solve these two problems that would have killed the Big Bang. And that all resulted from their observation that the CMB exists. All right, so there's a few things we could say about the CMB that shows it isn't even evidence for the Big Bang, but it gets technical real quick. But suffice it to say, again, it doesn't demand that the Big Bang is true. It would be predicted to exist if the Big Bang were true. But it would also be predicted to exist from other phenomena instead of the Big Bang, again, which creationists have our own explanation as to what could be going on. So the big question comes down, though, to inflation. That's the big question, because that's what they had to make up to fix the horizon and flatness problem. That's the big takeaway that I want you to get here. Horizon and flatness problems are the big problems with the Big Bang. They made up inflation in order to try to solve these problems. So is inflation true? If not, then those two Big Bang problems haven't been resolved. So what do we do with inflation? Well, the primary problem with cosmic inflation is, guess what? It has absolutely no evidence. Right? Once again, who's got the blind faith here? Who's drawing conclusions not warranted by the evidence? It is a blind faith. It's not science and can't be taught as such, and yet it is necessary in order for the Big Bang to be true. Now, it's interesting the way this went down. It was 12 years ago. I remember all the media hype about it. You might not even know what was going on, but if you stay up with the scientific literature, this is a big deal. Everybody was excited. In March of 2014, they thought they had discovered gravitational waves from the Big Bang, from, they thought, inflation. They thought, finally, we've got evidence of inflation. Now we think we found gravitational waves from black holes colliding. That's a different story, not a big deal there. But they thought they had found actual evidence of inflation. And so you had all these headlines in the science magazines where they're like, the Big Bang, theory no more. It's no longer a theory. It's proven. They had one called Big Bang's Smoking Gun Confirms the Early Universe's Exponential Growth. Space ripples reveal Big Bang's smoking gun. This is the evidence. We found it. Case is over. So the media had the Big Bang is finally conclusively proven. Well, within 3 months of what they thought they had found, all the major science magazines started backing away from it. By October of that year, remember they were coming out with this stuff in March. By October, Nature, New Scientist, Scientific American, American Scientist, and science magazines had all but thrown the discovery under the bus and argued that the team that made the discovery was probably just seeing the effects of local dust in space. But they were courting the possibility that maybe it could still be true. And then it wasn't until January that Nature came out with this article, Gravitational Waves Discovery Now Officially Dead. Combined data from South Pole Experiment, BICEP 2, and Planck probe point to galactic dust as confounding signal. So bottom line, there is no evidence for inflation. None at all. Zero. Even though it is needed to fix the flatness and horizon problems that stand in front of the Big Bang Theory as being true. That is their model. And there are actual observable evidences that say the Big Bang can't be true, and the only way it can be is for them to just make up inflation blindly with no evidence for it. Just blind faith. I believe in you, inflation. All right? It's not based on actual evidence. And they want to say we're the irrational ones? You follow here? Now, young people, you don't get to hear this in your schools, right? You don't get to hear this stuff being scoffed at the way they scoff at you constantly for your beliefs. But the truth is, they're the ones that have the silly ideas, not us. Now, really, the problem's worse than this, because if inflation were true, even though it would theoretically cure the horizon and flatness problems, it creates other problems. Because it brings up questions like, why did this even happen? Like, what caused this, and what would make it stop? They don't have any explanations for that, too. I mean, they just literally just made this up, you know. So the evidences that are brought forth to prove the Big Bang are inadequate. They're riddled with issues, anomalies that run counter to the possibility of universal expansion exists. The horizon and flatness problems exist, leading to them making up inflation, which has no evidence. So the Big Bang is not warranted by the available evidence, making it a what kind of belief? Irrational. One should only draw those conclusions warranted by the evidence. The model fails to make accurate predictions, making it unscientific, and constantly has to be updated ad hoc to stay in line with the latest evidence. But besides the inflation fiasco that I alluded a moment ago to, the latest issue being these images that have been pouring in from the James Webb Telescope over the last couple of years. Who all knows what I'm talking about with the James Webb Telescope? Have you heard of this? A few of you have. So a couple years ago, we launched this really cool new fancy schmancy, all the bells and whistles telescope into space, where we can see farther and clearer now than we ever have. And theoretically, the farther the star is, the farther back in time you're seeing. Okay, because if you see a star farther away, that means it took longer for that light to get to you. So you're seeing what it looked like further back in time, right? That's assuming the light traveled here in a natural way, which is a big assumption from the creation model. But from their perspective, if it traveled in a natural way, you're seeing things further back in time. So they're all excited because we're going to get to see things closer to the Big Bang. Well, guess what they find when they look at these galaxies? They find they're already very mature, even though they're really close to when the Big Bang is thought to have happened. So they're like, okay, we're not supposed to have these like fully mature galaxies until like 1 billion years after the Big Bang, and yet these are only like 300 million years after the Big Bang. Okay, so 30% of that time. So what do you think they're going to do? You think that's going to make them go, oh, well, I guess the Big Bang's wrong? No, because they hold to a blind faith. This isn't based on evidence. They're not interested in drawing conclusions based on the evidence. They believe in this. So it doesn't matter what you say, they're just going to twist things. So they got two options. Either they make the universe older, which is now what they're talking about. Well, maybe the universe isn't 13.8 billion years. Maybe we need to add on another 500 million. Or, I guess universes can just spontaneously form really fast. Guess how many universes we've ever, like other galaxies, we've ever seen form? Guess how many stars we've ever seen just spontaneously form out there? Right? Again, they have to blindly believe that this can happen. There's no evidence of that. You know, granted, if you assume naturalism, then you know it happened, even if you can't see it. And that's, remember, why I started with that quote from the National Academy of Sciences. They're telling you, they're laying down here's the rules of the game. You just assume only nature. Okay, ready to go. Therefore, since there's only nature, well, we know life can come from non-life. We know stars can create themselves because we've already assumed only nature exists. It doesn't matter if there's no evidence for it. You see this? I mean, when you uncover this, you see how simple and silly it is, but this is what is convincing young people and causing them to leave the faith. Because it's not being made clear to them. This dust isn't being cleared out in front of their eyes. Other problems. The Big Bang hinges on what we call the cosmological principle. This is the idea that the universe is uniform and homogeneous. It's supposed to be spread out evenly if the Big Bang happened. And so the Big Bang doesn't work if that's not the case. But they recognize the universe isn't uniform and homogeneous because we have stars and galaxies and clusters of galaxies and so forth that make things clumpy. It's not smooth. It's clumpy. So they call this, not creationists, they call this the smoothness problem. And there's no good explanation for it in the Big Bang cosmology. All that they can do is, it looks clumpy, but if we zoom way out, now it looks smooth. That's their explanation. That's the best they can do. It's not what it's supposed to be if the Big Bang happened. In other words, one of the things you have to be able to do if you have a scientific theory is, you should be able to say, okay, if my theory's right, then when I go make this observation or experiment or do this research, this is what I should find. And if I don't find that, guess what? It falsifies your theory. Now, if you do find it, it doesn't necessarily prove your theory because there could be other reasons for that same observation. So it's way easier to falsify a theory. But the Big Bang is not able to be falsified because they just change it. It doesn't fit? That's okay. We're still just going to keep changing it. I mean, you can follow this historically, the way this has gone down. They hold to it with a religious zeal. How about this one? Energy can be transformed into matter, according to the first law of thermodynamics. But when this happens, an equal amount of antimatter also forms, which is basically normal matter with reversed charges on its particles. So an equal amount of antimatter is always produced, without exception, in the laboratory when this happens. So if the Big Bang is true and energy is transformed into all the matter of the universe at the beginning, which is what they claim, there should have been an equal amount of matter and antimatter generated, which then, when touched, would have annihilated each other, releasing their energy. That's what happens. Obviously, that didn't happen if the Big Bang's true, right? So the universe is virtually completely composed of regular matter. So they term this the antimatter problem. There's missing antimatter. If you stick with the actual evidence, there's a lot of evidence. The Big Bang can't be true. There's what's called the Fermi paradox. Again, this is their own acknowledgments of problems. If the universe is as old as the Big Bang would suggest, where is everybody else out there? Where's the aliens? Where's the extraterrestrials? You've got billions of stars and even more planets out there. There should be other planets where the conditions were just right for life to evolve long before life on our planet did. Those creatures should have long ago evolved and colonized our area of the universe. We should have seen them. So where are they? And they call this the Fermi paradox. So, like Star Trek is based on this idea, right? And so is Star Wars. It's really based on the concept that these things, that there would be other, evolved intelligent creatures that are even more intelligent than we are. There should be. They demand that's the case. But you don't see it. It's as though the earth is just that special. It is the only planet upon which intelligent life exists. Now keep in mind, they even have a name for this. I could do a whole session just on this too. See, there are things I had to cut out. This is called the anthropic principle. They call this the anthropic principle. This is where, if you read the literature of the leading cosmologists in the world, they speak more eloquently about the amazing design of the universe than creationists do. Because I read a lot of their articles on the multiverse. Excuse me. I've got in my book, Science versus Evolution, there's an appendix devoted to the multiverse, because that's kind of the direction the cosmological community is going with, to try to explain things. And they talk just eloquently about the amazing design of the universe, that it's just too perfect. Not just perfect, but perfect specifically for life on Earth to exist. And they'll talk, detailed science about how perfect it all is. These are atheists, right? And that they call it the anthropic principle. Anthropos, man. What they're saying is the universe seems specially tailored for man in particular on Earth. And so they're ripping their hair out about this issue because of how perfect the universe is for us. They call the Earth the Goldilocks planet, right? It's just right for humans. Well, they've now blown that up. It's really not just our solar system. It's the whole universe seems to center around the Earth. So you know how they deal with this problem? It's blind faith again. They say, so there's this guy that is a cosmologist out at Queen's Mary University in London, Bernard Carr. And he wrote in an article, he said, if you don't want God, you better have a multiverse. Okay, so what's the multiverse? It literally came out of the comic books. It was literally invented by comic book people. And it's the idea that we don't live in a universe. There's actually a bunch of other universes out there. In fact, an infinite number of universes where you exist in another universe, living out an identical life to the one you are here. And you even exist over here, and you're living out maybe the opposite. Anything possible is happening. Guess how much evidence there is for the multiverse? It's none, and they even acknowledge it. They say not only is there no evidence, they come out and say there never can be evidence, no matter how much technology evolves. They come out and say that. But they say there's got to be a multiverse, otherwise there has to be a God, because it's the only way to explain how perfect this universe is. That's what they say. I'm not making this up. You read the quotes in the article. It blows my mind. So they just, amazingly, even their own, I'm going too far down this rabbit hole, but amazingly, their own guys will turn on each other and say, now guys, we can't do this because this is a blind faith. They'll come out and call each other on it. They're like, we can't sit here and be anti-religion and then say these things and believe these things. And they'll call each other out. And do you think that's stopping them? No, it's not stopping them because they don't want God. That's the issue. This isn't about the evidence. They try to paint themselves as, we're being logical and following the... No, they're not. They're not doing that at all. That's what they're making kids think they're doing, but that's not what they're doing. They're not following the evidence. All right, I took too much time on that. I'm sorry. We got more to hit. Dark fudge factors. That's my term on that. All right, so sometimes in science, engineering, for example, you'll develop a mathematical equation that will describe, say, the motion of something. And it works really well, but there's something complicated in the equation that makes it where your equation's a little bit off, and so you add a fudge factor. And that magically makes everything work, right? If there's engineers in here, you know what I'm talking about, especially if you're in mechanical or aerospace engineering. And this little fudge factor makes it where your equations don't have to be so complicated. Now, so it means that your equation's missing something in describing reality, but if it's tiny enough, the fudge factor, then it's not going to cause you big problems. So that can be fine and good. Now, here's the problem. Back in the 70s, as they continued to observe the universe, they started observing more and more things that didn't fit with like the Big Bang model. So in order to fix the problems, without just scrapping the Big Bang and naturalism, they started adding huge fudge factors to the universe, okay? And they came to be known things like dark matter. You heard of this? Dark energy. You've heard of these terms? They're basically robo-fudge factors, is what they are. Here's my fudge. This makes it way more yummy to think about fudge factors, I think. So at the time these concepts were being added to the models, in order for modern theories to work, 50% of the universe had to be made of this dark stuff. That was the only way the Big Bang was going to work, is if 50% of the universe was made of stuff that nobody had ever seen or observed, knew nothing about them. Nobody had a clue. So time went by, they learned more about the universe. You think the problem got better? It got worse. In fact, almost every issue of like New Scientist that I read every month, they got a new issue every week. Almost every issue of every week, they talk about this continued issue with dark matter, dark energy. We don't know what it is. We haven't observed them. Maybe never will. We know so little about them and what a major problem that is. So guess what they're saying these fudge factors are now? Not 50%. How about 96%? 96% of the universe has to be made of stuff that we don't even know for sure that it exists in order for the Big Bang to work. Now, it's unobserved, apparently unobservable. There's no actual direct evidence of their existence. All right, so can this be called science? Now, at least in the case of dark matter, we see some indirect observational evidence that suggests there might be some unknown stuff out there that's affecting things, but they don't know for sure, and its existence wouldn't even necessarily affect whether or not the Big Bang is true. But dark energy in particular, is needed in order for the Big Bang model to work. Now, ironically, other cosmological models are out there that are not Big Bang oriented, that eliminate the need for this massive fudge factor. But they're largely ignored because the Big Bang is held to with religious zeal, right? You're what's the word? You're a heretic if you reject this. Of course, the creation model is not on the table at all, of course. So dark energy is said to make up 73% of the universe in order for the Big Bang model to work. USA Today reported in August of 2009 that some secular scientists had discovered a way to eliminate the need for dark energy in the Big Bang equations. Dan Vergano said, mathematicians have come up with an answer Monday for the mystery of dark energy tearing the universe apart at an accelerating rate. What's their answer? It ain't there. Okay, so let me explain to you what's going on with dark energy. The reason they made up dark energy is whenever you look at the stars, it appears that they're not only moving away from us, but they're accelerating. Okay, now how do you accelerate something unless you add energy to it? You got to step on the accelerator. You got to burn some gas, right? So they're like, okay, well, that means there must be some unknown energy that's making it accelerate. We'll call it dark energy. Moving on. That's it. That's where it came from. That's the evidence for it. They don't really know it exists. There are other ways to explain it without making up some new energy that's unobservable, but that is what they came up with. There's got to be something propelling these stars to go faster. So Vergano quoted Lawrence Krauss, who's a well-known theoretical physicist at Arizona State University in Tempe, saying the only problem is that for the equations to work, we must be literally at the center of the universe, which is, to say the least, unusual, says Lawrence Krauss. I think this is plausible mathematics, but it doesn't seem physically relevant. In other words, it can't be that we're at the center of the universe. Why would that be? Okay, so that would make Earth pretty special, right? Which goes against what's called the Copernican principle. This is a just flat out assumption made by the naturalistic community when studying cosmology. This is the idea that the earth is not special. It's not in a central place in the universe because that seems too design-like. That would suggest a God. So it has to just be, normal, nothing extraordinary about it. So that's what he means. It's not physically relevant. I mean, we could say that there is no dark energy, but in order to say that we would have to be at the center of the universe. We can't say that. So we're going to hold on to our fudge factor, even though there's no evidence for it.
So they're not following the map.
No, exactly. This is not about evidence, right? That's one of the big points I want to make this weekend. This is not, the evidence is clear on this, on all of this stuff. This is not about that. They don't want God. Now, why that's the case, we look at in our last session on Sunday, by the way. But they're just going to stick with this enormous fudge factor. Here's another model proposed in 2008, which suggests similarly, maybe the Earth is centered, and it would eliminate the need for dark energy. Ron Cowan of Science News discussed the work of Robert Caldwell, who's a theoretical physicist out at Dartmouth, and Albert Stemmons of the Fermi National Accelerator in Illinois, and explain, okay, if Earth and its environs are centered in a vast billion light year long bubble, relatively free of matter, in turn surrounded by a massive dense shell of material, then gravity's tug would cause galaxies inside the void to hurtle toward the spherical concentration of mass. That process would mimic the action of dark energy. You understand what he's saying? In other words, what if on the outskirts of the universe there's a big shell of some material that you can't see? It would have gravity and it's going to pull everything towards it, which would make it accelerate. Just like if you jumped off a building, you're going to accelerate to the ground. That would be happening to all the stars. Okay, what's his response to that? Well, that scenario violates the Copernican principle, a notion near and dear to the hearts of physicists and cosmologists, including Caldwell and Stebbins. Remember what the Copernican principle is. You probably know that name. You might remember it from school. Copernicus, Nicholas Copernicus. Remember, he's the guy that said, maybe the solar system's not revolving around the Earth. Maybe the Earth is revolving around the sun. And that was considered heretical, right? The Catholic Church, crucified people basically over this idea. But, Copernicus was right about that. And it wasn't anti-Bible, but from that came this principle where the cosmologists now are like, well, the Copernican principle is the Earth is not special. There's no God. That's where they went with that, even though Copernicus was actually a creationist. Named after the 16th century astronomer Nicholas Copernicus, who made the then heretical proposal that Earth does not have a favored central position in the solar system, the principle states that humans are not privileged observers in the universe, but have just as good or bad a vantage point as any other observer in the cosmos. All right, so then Caldwell and Stebbins say, although the Copernican principle may be widely accepted by fiat, in other words, just an assumption, it's imperative that such a foundational principle be proven. All right, so they're pushing back against this Copernican principle in this case, even if it makes it where it seems like maybe the Earth is kind of special. Even though these guys are not, theists, right? They don't believe in a God or anything. They still hold to the Big Bang. Now, interestingly, creationists have a theory where we think that may be what is going on, and it has to do with what happened on day 2. And we're not going to go down that rabbit hole right now, even though you're probably really interested in it. I know I would be, but we don't have time. I do talk about it in the other seminar, though. Summarizing the state of the Big Bang today in light of the inflation problem. Remember what inflation is. It's the expansion that's faster than the speed of light at the beginning of the Big Bang. There's no evidence for it. So in the midst of all the fray back in 2014, whenever they thought they had found, we finally found gravitational waves, Paul Steinhardt, who's a Princeton theoretical physicist and cosmologist, he's one of the guys that initially helped to develop inflation theory. And then he turned on it and is now a scathing critic of it, to his credit. He wrote this stinging critique of inflation when all this was happening in 2014 and all of this supposed evidence for gravitational waves that they were throwing around. He argued that premature hype over gravitational waves highlights gaping holes in models for the origins and evolution of the universe. He said the Bicep 2 incident has also revealed a truth about inflationary theory. The common view is that it is a highly predictive theory. Remember, in science, you've got to be able to make predictions. We're not talking about predictive prophecy. What we're saying is if my theory is right, this should be what I find when I do this experiment. The common view is that inflation is a highly predictive theory. If that was the case and the detection of gravitational waves was the smoking gun proof of inflation, one would think that non-detection means that the theory fails. It should falsify inflation. Such is the nature of normal science. Yet some proponents of inflation who celebrated the Bicep 2 announcement already insist that the theory is equally valid whether or not gravitational waves are detected. How is this possible? The answer given by proponents is alarming. The inflationary paradigm is so flexible that it is immune to experimental and observational tests. The paradigm of inflation is unfalsifiable. It's clear that the inflationary paradigm is fundamentally untestable and hence scientifically meaningless. And that is the state of inflation. It is necessary for the Big Bang, and yet they've got nothing for it. And they still blind. If you go into any natural history museum, young people, you're going to see them tell you, without any disclaimer, this is how it all happened. Just a bunch of superstitious mumbo-jumbo they're shoving down your throat that is based on a blind, irrational, evidenceless faith. Problems like these have caused many cosmologists to completely reject the Big Bang. The number's growing. In fact, in 2004, New Scientist published a statement that was signed at the time by 33 scientists from 10 different countries that looked at the evidence and backed away from the Big Bang, rejected it. The list now has grown to have hundreds of scientists. So here's the statement that is being signed by these guys. Here's how it starts. Big Bang Theory relies on a growing number of hypothetical entities, things that we have never observed. Inflation, dark matter and dark energy are the most prominent. Without them, there would be fatal contradictions between the observations made by astronomers, the actual evidence, and the predictions of the Big Bang Theory. In no other field of physics would this continual recourse to new hypothetical objects, where they're just making up new stuff, be accepted as a way of bridging the gap between theory and observation. It would at the least raise serious questions about the validity of the underlying theory. But the Big Bang Theory can't survive without these fudge factors. The Big Bang Theory can boast of no quantitative predictions that have subsequently been validated by observation. So this is not science that they're doing with this. It's at least good to know there are some people willing to stand against this Big Bang garbage. Of course, the most fundamental problem with the Big Bang, or any naturalistic theory, is that it can't explain the beginning of things. So even if the Big Bang were true, it doesn't really answer where the stuff came from that banged. So where did the laws of science come from? We looked at that in our last session. The Big Bang can't answer that question. The naturalistic evolutionist just has to believe laws of science can create themselves, even though there's no evidence for that. Nobody's ever witnessed that happening. Another problem then is, where did the stuff that banged then come from? Where did the cosmic egg come from? And that's where I want to camp out for a bit here as we round this session out tonight. The ilum is what they call it, the cosmic egg, right, that gave rise to everything. Let's see what they have to say about this. Remember that scientific laws don't have exceptions. They apply to nature, not necessarily supernature. And they're rational. They got plenty of evidence that demands they're true. If anything can be said to be scientific, it would be the laws of science. So do they support evolution? That's the question. And if a theory contradicts the laws of science, how should it be viewed? All right, let's look at the first law of thermodynamics. This is probably one of the most fundamental of the laws of science. This is sometimes called a super law, because other laws are based on the truth of this law and the second law of thermodynamics. These are super laws. And I want to take some time to look at this closely because this really speaks a lot about this issue. This is what one thermodynamics textbook said. The principles of thermodynamics have been in existence since the creation of the universe. The word thermodynamics stems from two Greek words, thermae, meaning heat. You'll recognize words like thermometer, thermostat, thermos. The second word, dunamis, which is our word power, dynamite, right? So it describes the early efforts by engineers to convert heat into using it for power as energy. So today thermodynamics refers more broadly to the science that deals with studying all aspects of energy and energy transformation. Now, what does this have to do with this origins question? Well, if you stand back and consider the question, where could the stuff of the universe originally come from? Where did, the universe came from somewhere. Where could it originally come? What are the possibilities? Let's make it a little bit more tangible. Let's say you buy a new house, you move into this house, you go up into the attic, and you see a box up there. And this box is sealed. You can't even see where it ever was not sealed. Like you don't see a seal anywhere, and yet you shake it and you realize there's something in there. There's like a ball in there. Okay, so how did the ball get in there? What are the possibilities? All of them, even if they sound crazy. Well, either someone put it there, okay, so either they put it in there and then sealed it, or maybe built the box around it, or no one put it there. It just always existed in there, or somehow just popped into existence in there, Now, the same options are available for the origin of the universe. How did it get here? Now, the creationist, of course, says someone put the universe here, the very first verse of the Bible. We go ahead and get to the bottom of this. In the beginning, God opened up the box and put the stuff there, right? That's what you get. Now, how would you describe that from a thermodynamic perspective? Well, you would describe the creation model like this. You imagine this box from the garage, and you imagine that it is big enough to put the entire universe in it. So a pretty big box, okay? And the box is the exterior boundary of the whole universe. Everything in the universe is in that box. So from a Big Bang perspective, it's the blast radius of the Big Bang. Now, it represents what we call a closed system in thermodynamic terminology, which what we mean is there's nothing going into our box or leaving it. It's a closed system because it's big enough to hold the whole universe. And there's nothing outside of it if naturalism is true, because only nature exists. There shouldn't be anything. The box is nature. So according to the creation model, there is something outside of the box, and before day one, the box was completely empty, and God essentially opens the box, creates the universe, puts it in the box, and then closes it and seals it so that nothing else could enter or leave the box. So the box has remained closed since then, except at any times when God chooses to engage in miraculous activity, where he momentarily puts the laws of physics on hold and then does something that is not normal, not natural, that is above nature or supernatural. All right, now, that's the creation model. The evolutionary model, the Big Bang model, would claim all of the matter and energy of the universe was originally crammed into this speck we talked about, the Ilum. And then they say it's, for some reason, it explodes. You have this explosion type event. Really, it's just rapid expansion. And then you eventually have the universe as it is today. Now, of course, that doesn't really explain where that little Ilum came from, though. Where did it come from? So even if you were to grant the Big Bang, the Big Bang doesn't answer that question. Notice what Alan Guth said. He's an MIT physics professor. And he admitted this very point, that the Big Bang's not really explaining this question, answering that question. Inflation itself takes a very small universe and produces from it a very big universe. But inflation by itself does not explain where that very small universe came from. All right, so notice he says a proposal that the universe was created from empty space is no more fundamental than a proposal that the universe was spawned by a piece of rubber. It might be true, but one would still want to ask where the piece of rubber came from. All right, so logically speaking, you got three options. The well-known philosopher from the 1800s, Herbert Spencer, put it this way: respecting the origin of the universe, three verbally intelligible suppositions may be made. We may assert that it is self-existent, so it's always existed, or that it is self-created, or that it is created by an external agency outside of the box, all right? So those are the three options, and which one's right? Well, in the immortal words of Sherlock Holmes, when you have eliminated the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth, all right? So if two of the three possibilities can be shown to be impossible scientifically because they go against the laws of science, then the alternative must be the case. So if you've eliminated God from the picture, you really only have two options. Either it's self-created, this is spontaneous generation of matter and energy, or it is self-existent, it's eternal. So let's look at the spontaneous generation side. Is that route is the one that most of the scientific community goes with today. The idea that the stuff just popped into existence, right? So in a thermodynamic sense, what you're saying then is, if you take that route, the original box is completely empty. So let's zoom inside of the box. The spontaneous generation model says nobody put it in there. It hasn't always existed. It put itself there. So according to this model, you can just stand around inside of this box and stare into nothingness and just give it enough time. All of a sudden, ta-da, something can just appear. And not only could something just appear, but according to this version of the model, a little ball containing all of the mass and energy of the entire universe can just pop into existence. And then, so they say, for some reason, the Big Bang process begins, and you have atoms, molecules and atoms and stars and galaxies, and the universe is expanding. Life pops into existence, gradually evolves over time, and then you accidentally show up in the universe. And this is the popular thinking today that the leading minds of the evolutionary community hold to. Now, there's some problems with this idea, and one of them comes in the form of the first law of thermodynamics. Willard Young, in his Fallacies of Creationism, said energy can be neither created nor destroyed, but can only be converted from one form to another. So there's no argument there. That is the implications of the first law of thermodynamics. We also call this the law of conservation of matter and energy. So young people, you'll see this in your textbook as either the first law of thermodynamics or the law of conservation of matter, the law of conservation of energy. Is really talking about the same thing. So what does this mean practically speaking? The first law says that in any process we've ever seen in the universe, like wood burning, energy will change into other forms while it's burning, like heat, light, smoke, ash. But the sum total amount of energy that was in the universe before you burned that wood equals the amount of energy in the universe after you burned it. So energy hasn't disappeared or been destroyed from the universe by burning that wood, and energy hasn't popped into existence in the process. So using more technical terminology, the first law says that in any kind of system, as long as you need to keep track of your boundary, but in a closed system in particular, like our box that contains the entire universe, so there's nothing coming into the system because there's nothing outside of the system if you're a naturalist. So nobody's out there to open the box and put anything in there. Nothing's leaving the system because you've made the boundary big enough to hold everything in there. The amount of energy within the boundaries of that system will remain constant. So the amount of energy present before a process in that system, like wood burning or anything, has to equal the amount after. So if you start with 0 before any process, guess what you're going to have after a process? In fact, if you start with 0, there can't be a process, right? So nothing pops into existence. I know this is complicated. This is really complicated for you, I know. You know, in the immortal words of Billy Preston, nothing from nothing. Y'all know that song? Nothing from nothing. Even Billy Preston got it with that fro. So in other words, it really doesn't matter how long you stare into empty space, a pew is not going to pop into existence. I'm sorry. and it's certainly not going to come to life and start strolling around. And it really doesn't matter how much time you wait for that to happen. Nothing's going to pop into existence, not something as simple as a molecule, a tree, a fish, an ape, definitely not a human, and definitely not something, all of the energy of the entire universe. That's not going to happen. And keep in mind, there are no exceptions to this law. There's never been an exception witnessed. So by implication, it would be unscientific, so it'd go against the laws of science, to believe that matter and energy could come into being in such a way that the first law of thermodynamics is violated. And because you're believing in something that doesn't have sufficient evidence, you're being irrational if you accept this. According to the first law, the only way that matter and energy could appear inside of this box is if it's caused to appear there by something outside of the box. That's what you learn from the actual evidence. Now, evolutionists who believe in spontaneous generation actually admit there's no evidence for it. Atheist Victor Stenger, who's an evolutionary particle physicist at the University of Colorado, and he believes in spontaneous generation. But he actually came out and said, I must admit that there are yet no empirical or observational tests that can be used to test the idea of an accidental origin. I'm going to believe it anyway. No wonder British evolutionary biologist and atheist of Oxford University, Richard Dawkins. Notice what he said in an interview in 2012.
Of course it's counterintuitive that you can get something from nothing. Of course common sense doesn't allow you to get something from nothing. That's why it's interesting. It's got to be interesting in order to give rise to the universe at all. Something pretty mysterious had to give rise to the origin of the universe.
You tracking this? Now, the fact that he says it with an English accent that sounds cool, don't let that, mess you up here. Think about what he's saying. He's acknowledging, he's talking about the origin of the universe. You have to get something from nothing. And he recognizes that's counterintuitive. It goes against our common sense. But to him, that's just interesting. He's going to believe it anyway. He's going to blindly believe in this. And he recognizes whatever happened. It had to happen. It's pretty mysterious. Okay, insert instead of mysterious, supernatural, because that's really what he's talking about. What he's saying is, if it goes against your common sense and intuition, it means it's not natural. Okay, but otherwise it wouldn't be against your common sense and counterintuitive. It would be like, oh, well, this happens. He's acknowledging this doesn't happen. So he's saying this is not natural in order for this to happen. One of the points that I try to make on this seminar too is there's really no such thing as a naturalist. Everybody is a supernaturalist. Everybody has to believe things have happened that aren't natural. Young people, try to get your mind around that and memorize that concept. This is a point you need to make to any atheists that come at you on this. Everybody has to believe in things that don't happen in nature. Every atheist must believe that life came from non-life. That doesn't happen in nature, so they're not really naturalists. They're supernaturalists. You're a supernaturalist. The question is, which supernatural model fits the evidence? That's the question. All right, we got the evidence for ours. They've got nothing, and they believe it anyway. It's a pure blind faith. Well, I'll give him something pretty mysterious happened. I'll give him that. No wonder many evolutionists reject spontaneous generation as an option for the origin of the universe. Famous evolutionary astronomer Robert Jastrow, notice what he said about this issue. The creation of matter out of nothing, right? He's talking about just creating itself, would violate a cherished concept in science, principle of the conservation of matter and energy, right? First law of thermodynamics, which states that matter and energy can be neither created nor destroyed. Matter can be converted into energy and vice versa, but the total amount of all matter and energy in the universe must remain unchanged forever. It's difficult to accept a theory that violates such a firmly established scientific fact. Pretty straightforward. A lot more I could say about that. Well, what about quantum mechanics, quantum fluctuation? I've got articles dealing with that in my Science versus Evolution book. Could spend an entire 2 sessions on that topic. The bottom line is, strictly according to the scientific evidence, the laws of science, specifically the first law, you can't get the spontaneous generation of matter and energy. They've got no explanation for how you do that, and yet that's the main belief that they accept. And keep in mind again, scientific laws don't have exceptions, or they wouldn't be laws. By definition, they apply to every case they've seen of the phenomena that the law refers to. Which is why this thermodynamics textbook put it this way: the basis of every law of nature is experimental evidence. And this is true also of the first law of thermodynamics. Many different experiments have been conducted on the first law, and every one thus far has verified it, either directly or indirectly. The first law has never been disproved. We can say that the second law of thermodynamics, like every other law of nature, rests on experimental evidence. Every relevant experiment that has been conducted, either directly or indirectly, verifies the second law, and no experiment has ever been conducted that contradicts the second law. The basis of the second law is therefore experimental evidence. In other words, it's logical, it's rational. You notice how much they're hammering this idea. The evidence from science is that the laws of thermodynamics are immutable, and yet they present a major problem for the evolutionary perspective. Once again, the creation model doesn't have a problem with this evidence. The first law says that in nature, things aren't going to create themselves. And if you believe in that, you're believing in witchcraft without a witch. The only way that you can get energy to come into being in a system that did not already have that energy is if it is deposited there from something not part of that system. In other words, the universal box that has everything from the natural universe has to be opened up, and the stuff has to be put in there from something supernatural, something outside of the box, which is what biblical creation model says happened. I think it's interesting that Genesis 1 tells us that that's what happened. It doesn't use exactly the same terminology as first law of thermodynamics, but it's implied accurately with what Moses writes down here. So Genesis 1 tells us God puts everything in the universe, and then Genesis 2 says God finishes, He ends it. In other words, He seals the box up where it's a closed system. That's what He's talking about with resting, so nothing else is being put in there. I think it's amazing that scientists didn't formally articulate this until the 1800s, and yet here you've got Moses writing this back in 1400s BC. So the creation model is in perfect harmony with the first law of thermodynamics. Now, briefly, what about this other option? Could matter have existed forever? Most have backed away from this. This used to be believed by a lot of scientists, but most have backed away because of the problems with this idea. The eternality model says the universe has always been inside of our box. It's always been there, either moving through space forever, expanding, or if you believe in the oscillating universe model, you believe that the universe operates in a cycle where you have a collapse, another big bang, an expansion, and then a collapse, another big bang, expansion. You basically just have this universal accordion. So this model says that matter and energy are eternal. They've always been here. But again, major problems with this in light of the actual evidence. First of all, there's what we call Olber's paradox. So Olber highlighted the fact that more distant star brightness, the more distant a star is, its brightness is lower. The number of stars visible, though, increases with distance. So those two factors compensate for each other and leave us with a prediction. So if the universe is infinite in size and age, right, so the universe has existed forever, where stars are uniformly spread out through the universe, then the entire sky would be filled with starlight. So that to us, the entire sky would be as bright as the sun at all times in every direction that we look in space. Obviously, that's not the case. The second major problem comes in the form of the second law of thermodynamics. So here's what Paul Davies said about this. Writing in New Scientist, he said, the celebrated second law of thermodynamics says, roughly speaking, that in any change, the universe becomes a slightly more disorderly place. The entropy goes up, the information content goes down. This natural tendency towards disintegration and chaos is evident all around us. All right, he's right about that. So returning to our wood-burning example, Remember that from the first law of thermodynamics, when wood burns, all of the energy that was there before it burned is still there, according to the first law. But the second law says that as it goes through this process, it's transforming into less usable forms of energy like heat. And as that heat dissipates, you're essentially left with a pile of ash, which isn't as usable. So all the energy is still there, but it's not retrievable as much. That's what the second law says. So in a technical sense, the second law builds on the first and says that in any process that goes on that we've ever seen, you've got less usable energy that comes out of that process along the way. You will have usable and less usable energy, and this is a one-way street. We can't turn this around. We call this entropy. And as Davy said, this is evident everywhere, right? You know, you can see this everywhere. Wouldn't it be nice if you could go down to a junkyard and get a clunker and just stare at it? And eventually, it will turn into this sweet Ferrari, you know, that is just, wouldn't that be neat? Now, I mean, God could have created, you know, a universe where that could happen, right? But we don't. We have this law. And it's by the way, they can't figure this out. Why entropy only goes in one direction? I mean, they're literally pulling their hair out over this issue. Why does entropy only work in one direction? They talk about this. They just can't understand. I can't figure out how do we explain this. Wouldn't it be nice, kids, if your room got cleaner just on its own? You know, you didn't have to put any effort into it, but it tends towards chaos, doesn't it? You got to do a lot of work to fight against it. Dads, wouldn't it be nice if, you know, I've thought about making a t-shirt for dads called Entropy Fighter, because that's pretty much what our job is. I mean, it's just constantly trying to push back against the decay. Preachers and elders need entropy fighters, but it's spiritual decay. All Christians are supposed to be spiritual entropy fighters. Yeah. I think that'd be fun. Would y'all buy the shirt if I made it? No. Maybe not. Again, just like the first law, the second law doesn't have exceptions. To date, no experiment has been conducted that contradicts the second law, and this should be taken as sufficient proof of its validity if you're being rational. All right, now what does this mean concerning the origins question? What's the implication? Well, it means the universe couldn't have always existed if we still have usable energy. So according to the second law of thermodynamics, if the universe is infinite in age, there shouldn't be any usable energy left. Everything should be completely worn out. We should be at a state of heat death. But yet we have this abundant amount of usable energy in harmony with the creation model, which argues the universe is relatively young, based on the genealogies, namely in Genesis 5 and 11. So the scientific evidence doesn't lead to the conclusion that matter and energy, the universe could be eternal, and that's why most scientists have backed away from that idea. Recall Robert Jastrow, considered one of the greatest science writers of our age. He said, concurrently there was a great deal of discussion about the fact that the second law of thermodynamics applied to the cosmos indicates the universe is running down like a clock. If it's running down, there must have been a time when it was fully wound up, right? So it couldn't have existed forever. Kitty Ferguson, award-winning, he says, modern science denies an eternal existence of the universe. He said, now 3 lines of evidence, the motions of the galaxies, laws of thermodynamics, life story of the stars, pointed to one conclusion. All indicated that the universe had a beginning. Kitty Ferguson, award-winning science writer and evolutionist, said it's common knowledge that the universe isn't eternal but had a beginning. Here is what Stephen Hawking said about an eternal universe. There must have been a beginning. Otherwise, the universe would be in a state of complete disorder by now, right? The heat death idea. And everything would be at the same temperature. In an infinite and everlasting universe, every line of sight would end on the surface of a star. There's the Olbers paradox idea. This would mean that the night sky would have been as bright as the surface of the sun. Now the skeptic says, yeah, but couldn't there have been an exception to the laws of thermodynamics at some point in the past? Well, again, according to the definition of scientific law, no, you can't say that. They don't have exceptions. So to claim that there's some unknown exceptions would be to claim something that goes against the available evidence. In other words, it would be being irrational. Now, a perpetual motion machine is a design that attempts to violate the first or second laws of thermodynamics. Did you know that? That's what these are. They're where you're trying to find an exception to the laws of thermodynamics. Numerous attempts have been made over the years to try to design such a machine, all without success. If you could actually do that, you'd be rich. But these aren't possible, and amazingly, even the United States government understands this, whether or not they fully grasp the implications. The laws of thermodynamics have been substantiated to the point that in 1918, the U.S. Patent Office declared they are no longer going to accept patent applications for alleged perpetual motion machines. The Patent Office was sick of getting applications for these impossible devices. They recognized the attempts as pointless. Well, Philip Yam, writing in Scientific American, said, claims for perpetual motion machines and other free energy devices still persist, of course, even though they inevitably turn out to violate at least one law of thermodynamics. There's just no exceptions to these. Now, to develop a theory that requires the breaking of the laws of thermodynamics would be unscientific and irrational. Developing a theory that sets the universe up as a perpetual motion machine, being able to exist forever in defiance of the second laws of thermodynamics, is unscientific, and it doesn't matter how much jargon a person throws up in the air to sound, smart about it. Believing in that amounts to irrationally drawing conclusions not warranted by the scientific evidence. Once again, though, the creation model, the biblical model, has no problem with the second law of thermodynamics. In fact, we would predict the second law of thermodynamics to be in effect. Notice, for example, what Hebrews 1 says, quoting from Psalm 102, 3,000-year-old statement. You, Lord, in the beginning laid the foundation of the earth, and the heavens are the work of your hands. They will perish, but you remain. Notice, they will all grow old like a garment, like a cloak. You'll fold them up, and they will be changed. But you are the same, and your years will not fail. In other words, he's not subject to the second law of thermodynamics. He's not part of the universe, but the universe is. It's growing old. He, on the other hand, has eternal power. His power is not going to run out. He's not subject to the second law of thermodynamics. So summarizing, looking at the first and second laws of thermodynamics, there's only three options for the origin of the universe: creation, spontaneous generation, and eternality. By definition, the laws of science have no known exceptions. The laws of science prohibit the only possible naturalistic models. The creation model is in perfect harmony with the laws of science and even predicts their effects. Therefore, the creation model is the scientific option. It's in harmony with the laws. It's the rational choice. It's in harmony with the evidence. And it's the only possible choice whenever you let the evidence speak for itself. And therefore, by implication, even though you can't see him, there has to be a God. Logically, it's rational to say that, based on the actual evidence. All right, we're going to fly through this one. You surely know this third law of science. The law of causality, or the law of cause and effect. If there's an effect, there must logically be a cause. Now, technically, it says this. The law of causality says that every material effect, okay, we're talking about things we've witnessed in the physical world, must have an adequate antecedent or simultaneous cause. So the cause has to be adequate. In other words, it's got to be strong enough to produce the effect. Has to be antecedent, meaning it comes before the effect, or it can be simultaneous with the effect. All right, the cause can be. Now, this is so obvious that scientists kind of take this for granted. It's assumed. But this is really what science is all about, if you think about it. This is what scientific experimentation is all about. You're trying to figure out the causes of effects and the effects of causes. And if there is no relationship there, you can't do science. Right? Scientific laws are all based on this idea. So this is another one of these super laws. These are essential. It's one of the reasons, I can go down a rabbit hole, I won't do it. We'll keep moving. So notice, here's what the National Academy of Science says. One goal of science is to understand nature. Understanding in science means relating one natural phenomenon to another and recognizes the causes and effects of phenomena. So causality, fundamental to the field of science. If a baseball comes flying over the fence in your backyard, you know that is an effect of some cause. Someone caused that, right? It didn't start just flying over there on its own accord. Leaning against a mountain is not going to cause it to topple over, because that's not an adequate cause. So we get this concept. Causalities is not complicated, right? If you're sitting in a room and a wind-up toy comes running across the floor in front of you, there's some logical implications to that. You know someone wound that toy up. If you open up the cookie jar and you see a half-eaten cookie, there are children in the house. Maybe dads, but we wouldn't. You look for the crumbs, right? A cookie didn't eat itself. If a chair is not placed in an empty room, the room will remain empty. Yeah. Now this is real complicated, right? This is rocket science here to figure this out. This is a major problem if you don't believe there's a God. There has to be a cause for the universe, for the matter and energy of the universe, the life of the universe, the DNA, the genetic code, the scientific laws. Atheists don't have explanations for these things. You know, the pyramids of Giza, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, they can't come to an agreement, scientists, about how these great structures were built and why. You remember the old movie Stargate? Anybody remember that from probably the 90s? It was like, well, there was aliens that came and they were involved, right? I mean, there's all kinds of crazy ideas out there. But even though they weren't there to witness whatever happened, they know they didn't create themselves, right? They recognize an ultimate cause, an intelligent cause for this, Stonehenge. How about that one? After studying these interesting rock formations, scientists concluded they were probably designed to allow some predictions based on the stars, but a lot of questions remain, including how this information was being used. How did they get these rocks transported there and set up so precisely? But one thing is clear, even though they weren't there to witness the formation of these, and that is that these didn't just create themselves, like some kind of big tornado rips up a mountain way away and just ta-da, they happen to be set up just like this. Nobody's silly enough to say that because we understand causality. There's got to be an adequate cause for this effect, and it requires intelligence. Now, are you going to tell me this is more intelligent than what you see in the human cell? Or the universe, where the cosmologists are ripping their hair out because of the design that is inherent in the universe? This is nothing compared to that. Common sense tells us there has to be a God, an ultimate cause here that is intelligent. Unfortunately, common sense has no place in the classroom or in science today. The universe exists, the planets exist, they're positioned just right, everything's positioned just right, doing exactly what it needs to do in our universe to do what it does to make it perfect for us. These are effects that require a cause. Life exists. This is an effect. There must be an adequate cause. Someone has to cause these things to happen, and yet the naturalist has no explanation. So evolutionists are in a fix trying to explain how the effect of this infinitely complex universe could come about without a cause. A few decades ago, Robert Jastrow, who I quoted earlier, he's a NASA guy. Notice what he said. The universe and everything that has happened in it since the beginning of time are a grand effect without a known cause. An effect without a cause, that's not the world of science. It's a world of witchcraft, of wild events and the whims of demons, a medieval world that science has tried to banish. As scientists, what are we to make of this picture? I do not know. Now understand, whenever he admits there's no known cause, he's talking about no known natural cause. So if atheism is true, there must be a natural explanation for what caused the universe. There must be an ultimate cause, and yet they've got nothing. Once again, the creationists not in this quandary. The very first verse of the Bible, God goes ahead and deals with the question. In the beginning, God opened the box, put everything in there. Which one is the scientific choice here? Hebrews 3:4. Every house is built by someone, duh. He who built all things is God. The ultimate cause of all living things, according to the Bible, that's God. Now, a big question that people typically ask in thinking about causality is, well, wait a minute, then what caused God? I mean, if everything has a cause, why wouldn't God have a cause too? Well, keep in mind, the statement, everything has a cause, is not what the law of causality is saying. Remember, every material effect must have an adequate cause. God's not material. He's not part of the physical universe, John 4:24. Remember that the laws of science only apply to those things we have observed. That's just nature. We can't observe supernature, so they don't apply to him. We don't know if the laws of science apply in the supernatural realm. A cause is not necessarily necessary for God, because you can't say one thing or another if you're with regard to the laws of science about that. But you can think through the logic of this. Let's say the laws of science do apply in the supernatural realm. Okay, well, let's reason through this. That means if there were ever a time in history when absolutely nothing existed, including no God, nothing in the supernatural realm, and now we're taking the first law of thermodynamics and applying it to God's realm. If there was ever a time when nothing existed, then there would still be nothing that existed, because things don't create themselves, according to the first law of thermodynamics. But we know that something does exist, at least the universe. So that means that there never could have been a time when absolutely nothing existed. That means something had to exist forever, because if there were ever a time when something didn't exist, nothing would still exist. All right, so what would the nature of that something have to be? Well, it can't be physical according to the second law of thermodynamics. So it's got to be something non-physical. That is what we call God. A non-physical being that had to have existed forever, that's intelligent and had to be all-powerful, all-knowing in order to create everything that we have in this universe. By the way, also keep in mind that one of the components of the physical realm is time. Time itself has to be created. So a person cannot argue that there has to be a prior cause for God, because that would imply time governing God. But God himself creates time. There literally can be no prior time before God. Because being omnipresent, he's already everywhere and every when. All right, let's look, as we wrap this up here, let's look back at our origin comparison chart here. Remember, if only one of these planks is shown to be false, the entire model collapses. The laws of thermodynamics indicate the universe couldn't have created itself. It couldn't be eternal. The law of causality adds more evidence that the universe couldn't have caused itself. Also tells us life couldn't have created itself, because life requires a cause as well. So the evolutionary model can't predict that at all. The creation model, again, is in perfect harmony with the laws of science on all counts. And first, second laws of thermodynamics and the law of causality. So if you were to stand back at this point and assess which model is best represented by the evidence, which one would be the rational scientific choice? God himself wrote the natural laws into existence which govern and have dominion over the earth. God alone is capable of such a feat. We don't even understand how he could do it. Laws certainly can't write themselves. The atheist can't explain their origin. And the message implied by these laws stand as a concrete testaments against atheistic theories to anyone willing to examine the evidence without prejudice. All right, a lot of material. I warned you it would be. So you can't blame me. And but we've got a lot more to come. I hope that this is, hopefully you're making some mental notes about some points that could be made to individuals that you encounter. You know, there was a time where, you know, if you would have asked, you know, get a classroom of 30 kids and you asked, do you know an atheist? You know, there might be one kid that would have raised his hand. Well, that's not the way it is anymore. Anywhere you go, they're everywhere. And even of those that aren't atheists, they're struggling with a lot of these kind of questions, and we need to be ready to talk to them about it. Very much appreciate your attention. If you got things you need to purchase back here or you need a card, let me know. I could even swipe cards, I think, with my device. I don't know when we start, Robert. I'm going to hand it over to you to talk about tomorrow morning.
Tomorrow morning, 9 o'clock, and we will begin with session 3. And do we do 3 and 4 and then have lunch? Is that how we do that? Okay, session 3, session 4, we will have a sandwich lunch. Sandwiches, fruit, things such as that. And then we will have 2 more sessions, I believe. Okay, I'm looking. It's 2 more sessions, and we will end roughly at 3 o'clock, and then we will have our normal worship time Sunday morning. So I appreciate everyone being here. Hope to see everyone tomorrow, and let's close with a prayer. Father, we are so thankful for all that you have created, all that you continue to uphold, for the presence that you have in our lives. Father, we're just so thankful for this universe that you have created and for our place in it. We're thankful that you've given us evidence that we are that we don't have to have a blind faith. But Father, we are thankful that once we have believed that evidence, then we believe in you, that you've given us your word, and that we have everything revealed for us in your word that you would have us to do in order to please you, Father. We know that there are many times that we do sin and we fall short, but we ask that you would forgive us of those sins, and we're thankful for the forgiveness that is in Christ, and it is through him that we pray. Amen.